sweet dreams are made of this.
This story took place at my childhood home in Minnesota. I live in Oklahoma now. My sister and I were home alone and bored, so we decided to play some creepy games. Like the playing card game, which is probably the least deadly game to play in my opinion. Since that didn't pan out any interesting results, my sister and I decided that we wanted to play the Ouija board instead. The only problem with that being that we didn't have one, so we'd have to make one. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a piece of paper and a picture reference, and later we had our board. My sister, Kay, shut all the curtains and blinds in the living room and kitchen since that's where we were playing, while I collected a few candles to light. Once we were settled, I decided that I wanted to record our game with my phone and asked her to wait. Though, fair warning, I do have an Android, so the footage was dark and grainy. I was lamenting my woes when it happened. As I fiddled with my phone to try and get it to brighten, I turned it towards the window, staring at my surroundings through the screen. Then I shifted on the love seat in order to direct the camera down the hall leading to the front door. Now, on the corner right next to the living room was the door to the laundry room. This door was shut, and that is important information because, with the way this thing appeared, it wouldn't have been possible for a human to do. When I panned the camera over, it only took a few seconds before a humanoid head popped out from behind the wall, long dark hair shifting with the movement. I immediately stopped the film and tossed my phone onto the cushion next to me as I began to open curtains, not daring to move over to the light switch, which was right where that thing had appeared. Kay asked what was wrong, and, not wanting to scare her, I waited until we were out of the house before telling her, then letting her watch the video. The scariest part of the interaction was that, outside of the screen of my cell phone, there was nothing there. I'm just thankful that we never actually started playing the game. I can't imagine I would have liked anything it had to say. I actually kept the video and uploaded it to YouTube, so I caught whatever visited us on camera. I honestly probably wouldn't have believed it myself otherwise. A link to the YouTube video is in the description. When I was 17, my friend, George, was attacked by something supernatural right in front of me. My friends and I were very intrigued by Ouija boards towards the end of high school. We spent several nights, over a few months, cramming together and hovering over a planchette. We had a variety of experiences using the Ouija board, most of which you could describe as mildly supernatural or just plain old coincidence. One of the places we would frequent was the garage in George's family home. Like most garages, it was dark, damp and cluttered. George was as intrigued by the Ouija board as we all were. That is, until it started to target George. Over the course of different sittings, we would ask it all kinds of questions like who it was, what it wanted, how many fingers are behind my back. We still weren't convinced it was legit. We had the spirit tell us who they were, and when prompted for what they needed, they replied,
Kill George.
Needless to say, George was spooked, but in order to save face, he persevered. A sitting following that, we'd ask the same questions. As the conversation developed, a now different spirit had changed its mind and decided that it was the previous spirit and that it still wanted to kill George. This, paired with several events that George had experienced himself in the nights that followed, had driven George away from our little seances. We, however, were still more than happy to tinker around. We were not satisfied yet. On the last night we played with the Ouija board, We set up in George's garage as we usually did. He said that he had no problem with us using it in his garage and in his presence. He just did not want to participate. That night, it was just George, 2 girls and I. We turned out the lights and set up the board. We even lit a candle or 2, for good effect. George and 1 girl sat across from the other girl and I. We were all in coats because it was winter and the garage was poorly insulated. The 3 of us, with our hands on the planchette, had barely even begun when George's coat arm caught on fire. I remember watching him fling his arm around as he tried to smother the flame. I immediately jumped up and turned on the lights. It didn't take long for George to put out the flame. We quickly piled out of the garage into his basement, and after a few moments of panic and confusion, we diverted our attention towards George. He took off his coat and swore his arm was fine. There wasn't a single mark on his skin. We then diverted our attention to the newly charred coat arm. The burn was about the radius of a fist, and it burned deeply through the layers, just shy of the inner layer of cloth. The most startling part was that it was undeniably the shape of a goat's hoof. We hid the coat away for several days. Once we gained the courage, George and I pulled it back out in an attempt to debunk our little experience. After all, there were open flames in the room, and he had a cigarette in his hand. We applied a cigarette directly onto the opposite coat arm several times. We took a lighter to it in another attempt to simulate the same kind of flame. No matter what we tried, we couldn't come close to recreating the hoof-like burn. Over time, I thought that maybe George had decided to stage the whole thing in an effort to deter us from the Ouija board. He certainly had motive. That was 10 years ago. George and I are still great friends. Occasionally, I get confident that I can get him to fess up and press him on the subject. It's been 10 years, and he still has the same response, that he loved that coat and was just as surprised and terrified as we all were. Personally, I don't believe he staged it. I believe that what we experienced was authentic, and my perspective on life has never been the same since. I never believed in Ouija boards until I was in college. My freshman year, my roommate bought one, and we all decided to play with it as a hoax. We planned this whole thing out, and we scared him real bad. Next time we used it, we decided to actually try it and see if it would work. And it did. Too well. We lived in West Philly, next to a cemetery, and on land that used to be a mental asylum for indentured servants and slaves, as well as a farm where a lot of slaves died before abolition. Not to mention all the people who died to violence in West Philly over the years. We got a lot of interesting people at first. A doctor who died from typhoid fever, a slave who was whipped to death, a young man who was shot in the 80s. We were even able to find some of their graves in the cemetery exactly where they told us they'd be. It was like uncovering a key to the past, but then things started to get really bad. We got a child who refused to give us their name or tell us anything about their past. Instead, it kept asking us questions, and when we didn't answer, it would start to spell the answers out for us. Things that none of us would know about each other, or that we never talked about. Stuff like childhood nicknames in foreign languages, and embarrassing moments. We would play for hours, so it had a lot of time to spell out whole paragraphs. And then, it uncovered one of our friends' secrets. They weren't even playing at the time. Some childhood trauma she hadn't told anyone about. She started sobbing and immediately stormed out. We tried to say goodbye to the spirit, but it wouldn't let us. It was vehemently pushing the eye away from the goodbye. We finally hung up, for lack of a better word, and checked on our friend, who then told us the story. We were all dumbfounded. She never played again, but we were hooked. Unfortunately for us, every time we used it after that, we would get the same spirit. Eventually, we uncovered his name, Yubel, and he told us that he wasn't technically a real kid. He died during the pregnancy and killed his mother along with him. She never named him, so he picked his own name. He said we were his first and only friends, and that he loved us and would find a way to be with us. We immediately were freaked out and put the board away for good, since we were convinced Yubel was a demon. Only it wasn't for good. The board would magically appear around our dorm. It would be open and have the eye set to yes. We would hear strange noises at night, footsteps, croaking, rattling. Whenever we talked about anything in the room with the Ouija board, strange things would happen. My roommate had set up these glow-in-the-dark decals in his room. Our other friend said she liked them and that she wanted some. The same one who vowed to never play after it uncovered her secret. That night she went to bed, and when she turned off the light, her ceiling was covered with glowing symbols. She called us over and we all saw it, but when we tried to take photos of it, it wouldn't show up on our camera. After we turned the lights back on, they disappeared and never came back. We had enough, so we decided to play one last time and tell him to stop and leave us alone. He got angry and started saying a string of random numbers and letters. We googled them, convinced it meant something, and the only thing that came up was a radio station. We tuned in on our phone, and it was a religious radio channel, and the host said all the sinners who were listening would face eternal damnation. We were terrified, and then the eye rapidly started spelling out,
See you soon. 3, 2, 1, goodbye.
and as it did that, my friend's stuffed rabbit croaked as if it were a dead creature and flew off the shelf. We ripped him open to see if there was a voice box inside or something, to explain it, and there was nothing. We threw the board into the closet and never touched it again for the next 2 years. 2 years later, I came across it again, realizing it must have accidentally ended up in my stuff after we moved out, and I decided to play with it to see what would happen this time, thinking that the last time it was all an elaborate hoax my roommate had cooked up to get back at us for scaring him the first time. This time, it was me and a whole new group of friends. As soon as we ask the first question, it starts spelling out Y-U-B. I never let it finish. I immediately moved it to goodbye and told my friends we were done. I've tried the board several times since then, and every time I get Yubel. No matter who I'm with, people who have never even heard the original story. I'm done with these for life. Ever since playing with it the first time, I've attracted spirits like wildfire. I hesitate in telling this story because I don't want to contribute to the Ouija board stigma. It is in fact a board with letters painted, stamped or stenciled on it, or the way Hasbro makes them, a sticker on pasteboard. It is not a portal or a gateway, and nothing lives inside them. It would be rather tight. Energy feeds off energy, and the board being an inanimate object can't emit its own energy. That comes from those who use the board. I was given my first Ouija board by my grandmother, I think for my 14th birthday. She liked to give odd things for birthdays for some reason. A group of the neighborhood kids were bored and hanging out in my room. We didn't know what we wanted to do, so we just hung out, chatting about whatever kids chat about. There was one girl being snoopy and looking in my closet, and she spotted the board. She came out all excited and asked if we could try it, and I said, yeah, whatever. So two of them sat facing each other, with their fingers on the planchette and started asking questions. Silly questions like, does so-and-so like me? Or, does he have a girlfriend? Well, that didn't end well when the thing pointed to no, backed up a bit and pointed to no a second time. She got upset and decided she didn't want to play anymore. Then it was my turn with someone else. I forget what she asked, but the planchette didn't move, and she became frustrated, so she got up and someone else sat down. This is where things became weird. She asked if she could speak to her grandmother, who had recently passed because she missed her, and it pointed to yes. So the thing starts doing a figure 8. Slow at first, and then gaining momentum. Then it stopped. This girl started to ask if her grandmother was present. It said no, and she just had to ask who we were talking to. Well, that did it. It spelled out devil. A rocking chair across the room started rocking all by itself, real fast. There were screams and a stampede out of my room and out of the house. Luckily, no parent was home at the time. They didn't tell their parents right away, but later that night, they all had nightmares. And they had to tell their parents. Their mothers called my mother, all upset. Apparently, the fathers thought it was funny, but the mothers didn't, and I got in trouble. Even though I wasn't the one who pulled the board out of the closet, and said so, but that didn't matter. Grounded. The nightmares weren't all they suffered. Of course, looking back, I think that group exaggerated just a wee bit. They heard things and felt things that scared them so much, they slept in their parents' room at night for a week. I think that pissed the mothers off more than what happened. They were told to stay away from me. Thinking back, we kids were taken advantage of by a prankster spirit who knew exactly what to say to scare kids, and it worked. Other than being grounded and my rocking chair rocking by itself, nothing happened to me. I didn't have any nightmares, see or feel anything. The only nightmare was my mother. Some believe the idiometer is what causes the planchette to move. I think we, being hormonal teens at the time, worked a psychic connection or linked together, causing the chair to rock. Or it really was a trickster. This happened around 2 years ago, so if the details seem scrambled, that's probably why. My friend and I, who I will refer to as Q, were bored on a Thursday afternoon in January 2019. Naturally, as teenagers do, we decided to create a Ouija board to see if the whole hype around them was true. We assembled the board on a piece of cardboard we found in Q's recycling bin and followed a WikiHow tutorial on how to make a Ouija board. With everything set up, we began the process. We asked the standard questions that everyone asks, i.e., is anyone there, etc. We weren't having much luck, and just as soon as we were about to throw the board away, we finally got a response to our previous question. The planchette, we used a magnifying glass, slowly slid over to yes. I called Q out on his bullshit, but he swears to this day he didn't move the planchette. We kept asking questions, but we were getting very cryptic responses, mostly scrambled letters and such. Also, the planchette was moving very slowly at this time, taking around 5 seconds to transfer between letters and numbers. This all changed when we asked, "Where did you die?" The planchette quickly started rotating between the letters.
XZ, 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 XZ.
Q looked at me, with his face white as a sheet. I asked a question, "How did you die?" And it quickly moved over to a sequence of numbers.
10808080808088.
Starting to get spooked, we closed the session and burned the board. Nothing bad or paranormal has happened to us since that day. I tried to research the numbers and letters a few days after the session, but nothing showed up. This experience always nags my mind every once in a while. And now I've finally decided to hopefully get some answers. Does anyone have any idea what these numbers and letters mean? Okay, I haven't told this story, not even to my mum. This will be long, so I apologize in advance. This happened a long time ago. So my cousins, Kirite, male 14, Gero, male 16, Boni, male 15, Chui, male 14, and myself, female 14, found the board inside a box in my late great-uncle's house. It was also my cousin Gero's idea to play it. It did take some coaxing, but he convinced all of us to go to an empty field close to my nana's house and try and play with it. We had always been warned to never play with anything like this, but we were kids, and well, we liked to seek the thrill of not listening to the adults. Anyway, we did the ritual, or at least what we thought we had to do. We didn't have the internet to look this up, but we had heard from word of mouth from friends what we thought we needed to do, which was place a finger on the tab and move it around as we asked the board a question, and then stop moving when we finished asking the question. Seemed innocent enough. We asked a silly question like what day it was, and we got nothing. The tab didn't move at all. Then Boni asked, "When will I die?" And the tab began to move. We all laughed, thinking either Boni or Chui was moving it. But as it moved across the board, we all felt like an electric shock on our fingertips. It startled me and I moved my hand off because I felt scared. But quickly, Gero told me to put my hand back on, and he called out each letter as the board spelt it out,
Pronto.
which translates to soon. I remember the feeling around us went from nothing to frightening. I had the urge to back off and run away, but Gero, who could see I was very uncomfortable, reassured me that we were okay, that it was just letting the nervousness get to us. Now, because Boni had asked something that made the tab move, we told him to ask another question. He looked scared, but he finally asked if he was going to be killed. And right away the tab moved to the word yes. I'm not going to lie, when this happened, he took his hand off the board. I remember all of us just looked at him, and Gero tried to calm him. At this point, Gero said that it could be anyone moving the tab, but deep down, that was the excuse to keep the little piece we were holding on to. Because even as Chui, Kerite, and I still had our finger in the tab, we felt something when the tab moved. Boni said he was scared and didn't want to continue, but Gero told him that we had to finish what we started. Boni insisted that we stop, and Gero, like the real smooth talker he is, convinced Boni to keep playing. This time, Kerite asked when would Boni be killed. Boni was pissed he asked that. Kerite was the jokester amongst us. I think he was trying to lighten the mood, but Boni was on edge at the revelation. Anyway, the board answered 10. Chui then spoke up. He said, "Guys, I feel something holding me in place. I've been trying to lift my finger off since it moved this last time." That's when we all tried to get off the tab and couldn't. That's when Boni and Kerite panicked. They started to scream and Gero tried to keep us all calm. We were held in place by something, and it was horrifying. We couldn't move. It was like we froze in place. Gero, again, got my other two cousins to stop breathing hard and yelling. Chui and I were crying. Gero said, "We just need to finish the game, guys. We need to stay level-headed." He spoke calmly, but he was scared like us. Then I asked how we were to finish when we didn't even know how we started. Gero said we would just ask if it was okay to leave. He took a deep breath and asked if we could leave. It answered,
No.
Bonnie was a little more calm, but he said maybe we need to ask one more thing before asking if it would release us. Gero agreed, and he asked who was with us. It spelled out,
Satanas.
which is Satan. When I tell you the fear I felt, is something I never ever want to feel again. Once we realized what it said, it went quiet. Mind you, it was broad daylight, but we couldn't hear the wind or anything. It was like time froze on us. And again, cue the waterworks from Chewy, Kerite, and I. We were scared shitless. My cousin Gero then asked Satan, "Can we leave?" And it said
No.
There was no calming us. Then Bonnie began to yell at Gero. He lost his composure and tried again to leave, but couldn't. It was like our legs stopped working for us. Gero took a deep breath and said maybe someone new needs to ask if we can leave. And so Kerite asked, and the board went crazy. The tab went from side to side, our fingertips still attached, and suddenly we were released. We got up and we ran as fast as we could, leaving the board behind. I was sobbing and ran to my nana's house. My cousin Kerite and Chui ran home to their mothers to tell them what happened, while Gero and Bonnie ran to who knows where. I told my nana everything. She was upset, but she had my uncle drive us to where we had left the board, and it was gone. My nana got the boys around, and they swore they didn't have it. After digging around in their rooms, the board never showed up. Then my nana called a priest. He blessed us and had a healer pray over charm bracelets for our protection. And we didn't speak of this again. My cousins and I went different paths in life. Kerite became a politician. Gero, a lawyer. Chui, an owner of a cab licensing place. And Bonnie, well, he was a Class A criminal. Now, I won't give a year or where it happened, but Bonnie was murdered when he was 25 years old. He was one of 8 other victims of a supposed serial killer. He was shot twice in the face while he slept. His death was what reunited my cousins and I, and it left us completely mind-blown. The board had told us Bonnie would be killed, and when Kerite asked the when, it responded with just 10. I still think of this fateful day. Maybe life would have been different if we hadn't played with the board. Maybe Bonnie wouldn't have lived his life so recklessly, waiting for death at his door. I wish we could take it back, but maybe this was fate. This is the first time anything like this has ever happened, so I sought out this sub to see what you think. I was making tomato soup as a comfort food, because I was coming down with a cold, and I tried to switch the stove on, but it didn't do anything whatsoever. I checked outside to make sure there was no problem with the gas, and came back in and opened a window just in case there was some kind of gas fault, so the room didn't fill up or something. I don't know what I was expecting. The stove was completely off. By the plug, no gas or electricity was running through it. And when I turned back from opening the window, my soup was piping hot, with steam and bubbling. I literally cannot begin to explain it, but there was no steam when I came inside. Turned to the window and turned back, and it was hot. I didn't see anything blurry or hear anything extraordinary. It was just done. This is really a tiny thing, but it was a bit spooky and I can't explain it. I was leaving for work in a rush a few days ago, and on my way out of the bedroom, I stepped on a 20p coin that was on the floor in the doorway. I thought that was really weird because my change stays in my purse in my bag, and I have no reason to take it out while at home. My partner doesn't even keep change in the house. He keeps it at work for the coffee machine. So I couldn't figure out why it would have ended up there. I just left it as I was rushing and forgot about it. When I came home that evening, a parcel had arrived. The instructions for assembling it recommended using a coin to turn a big screw. Since I was assembling it on the floor right beside the entrance to the bedroom, I remember thinking, what a cool coincidence that a 20p is lying right there where I need it. However, when I turned to get the coin, it wasn't there anymore. I hadn't put it away and my partner wasn't home yet, so I couldn't work out where it had gone. But again, I shrugged it off and went to get a 20p from my purse. I used the coin to turn the screw and put it down out of the way while I finished up. When I was done and was tidying up, I realized I had put the coin down in the same place as where I had stepped on the first coin. I can't help thinking maybe I somehow placed down the coin and it appeared in that spot briefly in the past. If not, it's a pretty weird coincidence. Around 2015-16, I was getting ready to go out with my mother and grandmother to go to Hobby Lobby. And for those of you who don't know what Hobby Lobby is, it's a store that is full of art, craft items, candles, etc. It's like a Walmart for crafts and art. Anyhow, after I was done getting ready, I sat in my room playing with my parakeet because I had some time to spare. A bit of time had passed, and my mother, whom I told to get me when she was ready to go, hadn't come to get me. I walked out into the living room, and she was flabbergasted at my appearance. Not because of the way I was dressed, but because I'd come out of my room. My mother claimed to have come into my room, and she said the lights were off. She checked all around for me and assumed I went to my grandma's. She lives right behind my mum's house. I told her I was in my room the entire time, and we both felt strange after that. Now, before this entire event, my mother was very liberal, as well as a few of my other family members. A bit of time passed, and when I woke up one day, everything changed. My grandma, who was strictly against tattoos and dyed hair, began doing so. She got a tattoo and dyed her hair pink. I was highly confused and brushed it off as a change of heart. That was until my mother became this kinda hardcore conservative overnight. It was all weird. My other grandmother, who didn't like tattoos either, got one. Everything that I grew up with just changed. Little by little, I've been noticing more differences in my family from what I had grown up with. I kept trying to make excuses for it, but nothing was fitting right. I'm still stuck here, in this universe that doesn't feel like my own. I don't know what to do, and I've read theories that once you hop, you can't go back to where you're from. And this isn't like a political issue. I'm not mad that my mother is conservative or whatever. It's just totally different from the mum I grew up with. Things have gotten weird. Some of my lifelong wishes have come true, but nothing feels right. Ever since I realized all of this, my brain has gotten strange. I suffer from bouts of disassociation, which, at first, I thought could have been seizures, except my soul feels like it's floating above my body. Nothing feels like it belongs to me anymore. My body feels foreign often. It feels as though my soul is trying to connect with a body that never belonged to it. I know I kinda sound crazy, but I'm saying this with 100% honesty from my side. I was going to try to make a video, but I don't want to upset my family or scare them by making them think I don't care about them. I try to make this new life work for me, but nothing is helping. Does anyone know what I can do to adjust? I have memories that nobody in my family remembers, and I tried going to doctors who say I should get a brain scan and tests, but I can't afford that right now. They say I'm coherent enough to pass the tests, but don't know why I'm having these episodes of disassociation or minor brain seizures. I really, highly believe that this isn't my world. Those close to me can vouch for me, and I can get screenshots of old texts I've sent stating what I'm stating here. If anyone has any sort of idea what this is, please, I'm willing to hear it all. All I know is that doctors are puzzled, I'm puzzled, and nobody besides my boyfriend and closest friends know about this. If you're listening to this, thanks. This was a small venting session about my situation, and I hope someone might have some answers. I, a 40-year-old female, went to the supermarket with my husband, 43, and son, 7, last week. As usual, he stayed in the car with son while I went in. They usually park at the parent and child parking spot, right by the main entrance. However, because it was cold and raining, they left me right by the door before parking. 15 minutes or so later, I came out and spotted our car right in front of me. I walked by the back window where I see my kid's car seat, but nobody in it. And then as I walk to the front, I see an old lady sitting in the front passenger seat alone. She was gazing towards the front of the car, and I thought, gosh, I almost opened the door of the wrong car. Lucky she's not looking this way, or I could have scared her by trying to get in. So I kept on walking for a couple of meters. It's a small parking lot, and couldn't see our car, so I called my husband. He answers the phone and I ask him where he's parked, and he says, right in front of the store, parent and child parking spot. I turn around and there he is, same car, and our child strapped into his seat. Neither of them saw me or the lady that I saw in the car. I'm still doing mental gymnastics to explain this to myself, unsuccessfully. Today I went to a big medical center that I have to get specialty care with. It takes me about 3 hours to drive there, so I always use the restroom after I arrive. Because of the virus that must not be named, the most direct route to the restroom is blocked off. People have to basically walk 3 sides of a square to get there. But it's big, clean and nice, so it's worth it. As I rounded the final side of the square to the restroom, another woman said something to me, and I got held up in conversation. I watched a woman who had been walking in front of me walk into the alcove to the ladies' restroom. I watched her double-check the sign, then walk into the restroom. I hoped it wouldn't be too crowded. I'm like a hermit crab of a human. I extricated myself from the stranger, walked to the restroom, and walked into an absolutely empty room. 3 stalls, no people, nothing. I opened the door back up and double-check. Nope. Nowhere else to go. This woman straight up disappeared. I then had the most anxious pee of my life, washed my hands, and beat feet out of the weird bathroom that swallows people. I like Christmas. I like advent calendars, so I found a nice one online and placed an order for it. Beginning of December rolls around. Calendar hasn't come in the mail. So I look for the order in my email to check the tracking number. There's no email. The company has no record of me placing an order. My bank doesn't have any transactions relating to the order. My husband has no memory of me buying this either. He remembers I told him I wasn't going to be buying an advent calendar this year, which definitely not. I ordered it again, paid extra for rush shipping, and still don't have a record for the order, despite remembering getting an email confirmation. In fact, now, it doesn't even exist on the website. I've scoured all my records and pretty much I just need to accept I'm not going to have an advent calendar this year because it got lost in the Matrix. Twice. This glitch is very minor but still freaked me out. I was 100% sober when it happened. So the other day I drew a nice hot bath for myself and plopped in a bath bomb. This bath bomb was heart-shaped, pink and peach-scented. I kinda watched it fizz for a few seconds and then remembered to grab this little bath pillow I have from under the sink. So I grabbed the pillow and went to get into the bath, and the bath bomb is just not there. There's no evidence that it was ever there. I can't find it. The amount I did watch fizz was definitely enough where the whole bath could have diluted it to be unnoticeable, but where the hell did the rest of it go? I've had that type before, and it's definitely noticeable. Not to mention it takes literal minutes to dissolve and my back was turned for maybe 10 seconds. I'm stumped and upset that I had to sit in a plain, warm bath. What? My wife and daughter had the same glitchy experience at the grocery store earlier today. We were sitting there, eating, and she looks over at our son saying that he looks different today. Said that people change over time, but is it possible that someone can see the moment that a change happens? Then she kind of freaked out about a story she had to tell us. Wife and daughter were walking through a specific aisle, looking for a thing. Realized it was in the next aisle, turned the corner and started walking down the next one. But instead, restarted the aisle that they had just left from the beginning. Not like they turned around, but by a full circle. They noticed right away, so they turned around and checked the aisle they just left to confirm what happened, and it was a completely different aisle. She noticed a change in our son that I can't see after this weird glitch. Is it possible my wife just shifted realities? If so, what happened to my original wife? I want to share my story from my point of view. I was in the grocery store with my daughter doing some shopping. We were down the canned chili aisle. While walking by the chili to the left, I mentioned to my daughter that it was too bad that no one in the house liked chili dogs. She replied with, "Yuck, Mum, hot dogs are gross." I said, "Okay, well, we do need some canned corn." So I looked above the aisle to read the signs above the aisles, and noticed canned vegetables were in the next aisle to the right. So we walked, got to the end of the aisle and turned around. Before we turned the corner to the aisle on the right, I looked down and saw the chili to my left. I stopped and said to my daughter, "Hey, weren't we just down the chili aisle?" My daughter said, "Whoa, Mum, we were." Now we are standing outside the two aisles looking back and forth between both aisles. I looked to the one on the right, the one we were just down, and saw baking goods like flour and things. We both kind of tripped out a bit, laughing about it, chalking it up to we must be confused. I'm open-minded, but this definitely couldn't be possible. We wrapped up our shopping and came home. Fast forward to dinner time, minus a few details. The long story short is that I noticed my son's features looking slightly different to me. I kept saying how he just looked slightly older. Kind of like when you send your kid to camp for a week, and when you see them you notice how they aged just a wee bit from the last time you saw them. I asked my husband if he thought it was possible for a person to notice the moment of the slightest aging in a child. We are pretty open-minded in our house, and like to entertain conversations that don't fall in line with society's standards. It's fun and we like to think for ourselves. At some point, a while later, my daughter said, "Hey Mum, tell them what happened at the store." I told the story and my husband, being his lovable weird self, said, "I think you experienced a glitch in the Matrix. Maybe my old wife is gone and that's why our son looks different." I laughed it off because I like to always see the rational side of things, and also thought he was mostly joking. So he posted about it. I have no idea what really happened at the store. Had my daughter not been there to experience it with me, I might actually believe I, in fact, do have a mental illness. I have a huge maple in my backyard, 10-foot trunk. Well, I remember when I moved in, and several times over the past years I've lived here looking at it, knowing it needed to come down. There was a big piece that was cut off and had leaves and water in it, obviously rotten. Last weekend I called someone out to look at it, since I have some money to pay for it. He comes out and looks at the tree and asks me why I want it down. I say the big ass hole that's filled with leaves and rotten on the side of it. He looks at me as if I'm crazy and says there is nothing wrong with the tree. It could use a trim, but that's it. Now I know for a fact this tree was in bad shape. Even my wife said it was bad and needed to come down. But here it is, now fully healed, and everything is good. So this happened a few years ago. I'm in college now. I still think back on it and laugh because of how weird the situation was. I got my license when I was a senior in high school, a lot later than my peers, because I had crazy anxiety and driving made it worse, and I hated showing up to school sweaty. Eventually I had to get it because I would stay later after school, and my mum didn't want to drive to pick up my sister and then me later in 2 separate trips. This particular day, I was driving to school alone for the first time because I stayed home from school until after lunch at about 2 p.m. because of doctor's appointments. It usually took me about 10 to 15 minutes from my house to school, depending on traffic. And on the way there were a couple of 4-way stop sign intersections and light intersections. When I pulled up to the first 4-way stop intersection, a car coming from the left stop sign passed in front of me, and the man driving the car was straight up brushing their teeth with a large white electric toothbrush. I thought this was hilarious looking, and I remembered it because I could tell I had the same toothbrush, even from how far away I was, just because it was so familiar to me. It was so funny at the time because I grew up watching Mr. Bean, and I remembered an episode where he brushed his teeth in the car. I continued to drive to school and came up to the final stoplight intersection where I had a red light. That's when I saw a man driving his car, coming from the right through his green light. Completely different person and different car. And he was brushing his teeth with a big white electric toothbrush. I remember shrieking in my car alone because I was so stunned that I saw 2 people within the span of 5 minutes, both brushing their teeth in their cars. When I finally pulled into the school parking lot, I parked in the back row where all of my friends would park. We were all usually late, so ended up there, and I pulled my car into a spot right next to my best friend who was sitting in his car. And when I put my car in park and looked over at him, he was sitting there, brushing his teeth. Mind you, it wasn't an electric toothbrush, but still, I was sent into oblivion by seeing him there brushing his teeth when he should have been in class. I remember telling people about it for the rest of the day, there and after I got home, and no one really seemed to believe me or care that that had happened. But I think about it all the time, and it was such an odd time of day for it to be happening too, that it just always stuck with me. I'm so glad it happened to me, and thanks for letting me share. I worked on Halloween this year and took advantage of being allowed to ditch my uniform and dress up. As part of my vampire getup, I wore a bunch of jewelry, namely a bunch of rings. Specifically, I had on knuckle rings that kept sliding off throughout the day. I'm usually in charge of cleaning bathrooms before I leave for the day. So was the case on Halloween. As I'm grabbing some nylon gloves, I considered taking my rings off, but decided not to, as the gloves were slightly too small and wouldn't allow my rings to move. Just before I put the gloves on, I dropped one of the knuckle rings and heard it hit the floor with a loud ting, ting, ting. I slipped it back on, checked my other rings and put my gloves on. I'm female, so I only go into the men's bathrooms to clean them. As I'm finishing up and sweeping the men's, I look down and there's one of my rings. The rings are cheapos from Walmart, so I was thinking maybe someone had dropped their own. But I look at my hand and my ring is gone. There's no way that ring could have gotten off my finger and out of the glove and hit the cement floor without making a sound. And I hadn't removed my gloves since I'd put them on. Just yesterday, I had another glitch, and it's been bothering me ever since. I work in the photo lab at my job, and with the Christmas rush, I've been super busy with orders of all kinds lately. A lot of sales have been going on, so similar orders pop up one after another. In this case, there was a special for free 8x10s. I believe it was either Thursday or Friday. I printed a slew of them and was labeling them to be sorted into boxes to await customer pickup when I noticed I had 2 orders by the same person. A common theme with these types of specials. We'll say the name was Biggers. It was a very distinct name, hence why I remember printing it so well. I remember thinking, damn, I didn't realize there were 2 for her. I could have just put them in the same envelope. While I'd also gotten confused for a moment before, wondering why I had 2 pictures by the same person but couldn't find the label. So I found the label, packed them up and put them away. Amongst the other orders, I remember printing 2 orders of people with the same last name. We'll call them Loud L and Loud A. Loud both had orders, and I remembered them because they matched, and I see their names a lot while working. I packed them up and put them away. So yesterday, I'm at work and Miss Biggers comes in for her orders. I have 2, she says. I reply, yes ma'am, I remember printing them. But when I look in the boxes under the letter B, I only see 1 print. She tells me again, I know I had 2. I believe her and reiterate that I remember printing 2 for the reasons above. I go check the printer and search the history. Only 1 order comes up, the one I found. I go to the computer and search customer history. These never get cleared, so there are orders from a decade ago listed on there. And even if an order is cancelled, they aren't deleted, only labelled as cancelled. But there's still only 1 order on there. Unable to figure out what happened to the other order, I tell her to just resubmit it and I'll honor the sale, and I figure it's just a fluke. Until Mr. Loud comes in. I have one for L and one for A. Yes, I remember them. Except I only find L's photo, not A's. He insists that there are 2 orders, and I know he's right. Like before, I check the printer. I check the computer history. Absolutely nothing. These orders apparently never existed. I tell him this just happened earlier and play it off as a system error. I tell him to resend them and we'll honor the free price. When the manager, who was present while I was working on the orders originally, comes in, I ask her if she remembers those names and how I printed multiple ones. She says yes. I tell her they apparently never existed and aren't anywhere in the system. She's as dumbfounded as I am. I've experienced weird things in the past that I joked were glitches in the Matrix. But this is crazier than anything I've experienced and baffles me. I could explain the ring glitch away, but I cannot explain this one away. I regret not asking for order proof from the customers, like emails or order numbers, to see if there were any residual leftovers. Unfortunately, this story may be rather short, as I only got a glance at it. Additionally, this happened only about 20 minutes ago, so I'm still shaken up by it. Regardless, I'm a student at Auburn University. I was on the phone with someone, venting about why business majors need to learn calculus. Since me and her kept talking, I decided to not go straight back to my apartment, and instead drove down a country road while we kept conversing. The road is mostly surrounded by trees with some sparse houses and the occasional gas station or other business sprinkled along one side of the road. I knew I needed to get back to my apartment to keep studying, so after 4 or so miles, I turned around and was headed back. A few minutes later, still driving down the same road, and in a stretch with some buildings with their lights on to my driver's side, I glanced at my passenger side window and saw a pale, humanoid body leap out of a tree and land in the ditch to the right of my truck. It was rainy and dark, so I couldn't see entirely clearly, but there was enough illumination from a light on in a parking lot to make out human-like arms, legs, and just how white its skin was. It looked like it was curled up in a ball as well, which doesn't make sense why it would be doing that while jumping, but I know I could make out the clear silhouette of arms, legs, and I could tell that it was human-sized. I immediately pushed on the brakes to see if I could get a better look, and I swear I saw the red brake light glinting off the white skin as it moved along the ditch to the opposite direction from me and back towards the tree line. It was like I stopped thinking as what I just saw registered with me and the shock hit me. I looked in the mirror and my face was as pale as the thing's skin. The girl I was talking to had continued talking during all this, as she didn't have any idea that this happened, and I realized that I'd responded to the last few things she said with "sure" or other short responses like that. I thought about telling her what I saw, but I decided against it, as I didn't want to sound insane. I drove back to my apartment and told one of my roommates about it, who also is interested in things like this. He believed me, and we ended up joking about it a bit, which calmed me down. Sorry if this isn't the most descriptive or best written post. I think I'm still shocked at what I saw, but I wanted to see if y'all think there's any reasonable explanation or if it's what I think it is. What freaks me out even more is that I was on this subreddit earlier today. I've always been interested in stuff like this, and I stumbled across a comment where a guy said that his brother also had a possible sighting in Auburn as well. Please, let me know what y'all think. I work on a horse farm, and tonight while I was feeding my horse, I noticed they were all spooking at something on the other side of the farm, and my boyfriend kept saying there was a person on the other side of the farm. I thought he was seeing a tree that looked like a person until he pointed at where it was, and it looked like an unnecessarily tall person, and it started to move. I still thought it was a tree until we got to that side, and the donkeys that were put over there because of coyotes were acting scared, and they aren't normally scared. That's when I heard something in the woods, and we pointed the headlight over. My boyfriend grabbed his shotgun because we both thought it was a person, and then it sounded like it was running away, so I wasn't as concerned anymore. Until we saw one on the property next to the farm, and it wasn't a person. There is no way it was a person, but that's not what scared the both of us the most. It was when I was closing the gate and locking up that whatever was out there started running at me, and I ran to the car. When we got to the main road, it stopped chasing us. We looked back, and it was roughly 8 feet tall, and just standing in the middle of the road. I don't know what I saw, but I do know it wasn't a person. I don't know if what I saw was a crawler, but I would like to know if it was, and if they're going to cause issues out at the farm. Update. My boyfriend got to the main gate this time to see if it would chase him or if it was just going to chase me. And it chased him and chased his car down the road for a little bit. Probably should mention that he was cussing at it and probably made it mad. I've looked at some of the other stories and pictures on this sub, and I'm pretty sure that this is what we are dealing with. I had this encounter about a year ago, but I started thinking about it quite a bit recently. So I made an account just to post this, so please do tell me your thoughts about this. I had decided to go on a solo hiking trip for about 2 weeks. This would have been my second time doing something like this. The first 2 days of the hike were very average and relaxing, just a simple hike. But at night, things got a little bit weird. I went to sleep at around 9 or 10 p.m. and nothing much happened until around 2 a.m. I remember smelling a faint stench of rotting meat. It wasn't anything too crazy, but it was weird enough to somewhat wake me up. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but then I started to notice that something was moving around my tent. I did think that, because of the smell and the sounds, that it could be some carnivorous animal that maybe stank of rotting meat for whatever reason. But since I was half asleep, I wanted to make sure it's not a bear or something, so I opened my eyes to check around. Now, just a note that during the night, the moon was quite bright, so it was possible to see quite well outside. So when I opened my eyes, I could see a vague, lanky, humanoid shadow outside my tent. I didn't feel like I was in danger or anything. I did have a sidearm with me, so even if it was some creep, I didn't really feel threatened while holding a gun. After about a minute, the guy left, and the smell also disappeared. But since it was a very creepy encounter, I stayed awake for about an hour, and nothing else happened. And after nothing else happened, I went back to bed. The next day I had that weird feeling of being watched by something dangerous. But I don't know if it was because I was confident in my ability to protect myself or whatever, but I didn't feel like I was in any danger at all. I just felt creeped out. I didn't really enjoy that day all that much, to be fully honest, and because of that, I set up camp a lot faster than I usually did, but didn't go to bed at my normal time, since I didn't want someone sneaking up on me again. At around 1 a.m., I could smell that weird smell again, so I gripped my gun a little bit tighter and tried to find the guy. But instead, all I saw were just a pair of yellowish eyes in the distance. I stared at them for about 5 minutes, and then they just vanished, together with the smell. I didn't feel like I was being watched anymore during that night, So after an hour, I did decide to go to sleep. The next day, the feeling of being watched was back, but again, I didn't feel as though I was in any danger at all. But I decided that even though I felt that way, I would still rather cut this trip short instead of actually getting into a situation where I am in danger. So I started making my way back, though through a more roundabout path. Nothing really happened that night. The next day I suddenly could smell that rotten stench. It wasn't any stronger than before, but since I was in a decently large clearing at that time and didn't see anyone or anything around me, I did panic a little bit and started walking with a faster pace. I'm not exactly sure on how long I walked after that, but around midday, the stench got stronger. Now, I think it's important to note that I don't have the best vision and should wear glasses, but I don't most of the time, so when I looked around me and saw a grey humanoid figure quite far away to my left, I did panic. But by the time I put my glasses on, it was gone. After that, I really didn't feel like staying there for much longer, so I started doing a slow run to get out of there faster. I'd run quite a distance while feeling something following me, but then I ran into this strangely peaceful clearing where both the stench and the feeling of being watched stopped. It was a relatively small clearing with a few small boulders around. But the strange thing was that a man who was in his late 40s or maybe even early 50s was sitting on one of the boulders. He was wearing very plain dad clothes, definitely not something you would be wearing while hiking in the middle of nowhere. Plus, he had no gear anywhere near him. But the thing that I noticed first about that guy was his strangely bright green eyes. They weren't bright in the literal sense, but more like the kind of brightness you would see in the eyes of a child. After running for so long, I was exhausted, and the man noticed that and told me to sit down on one of the boulders and rest. I didn't even think about it and sat down. We talked for a bit, mostly about hiking and nature, and while talking, he had this very friendly smile that made me feel at ease. When I had rested, he offered to help me build my campsite in the clearing. He was very good at starting a fire. We shared a cup of tea, and he told me that it was very nice talking to me, but he has to go now. He didn't really say why or where he has to go, but he just stood up and left. That night I didn't hear any noises other than a few birds and crickets. When I woke up the next day, I felt very refreshed. I packed up and started to continue along the trail. I didn't feel like I was being watched or smelled that stench at all during the rest of my hike. Well then, this was the first time I've told this story in full detail. I usually say that some animal or whatever was following me, since that way people would actually believe me. But I decided to actually write exactly what happened. I also wanted to apologize for the long post and my English. I'm not a native English speaker, so please do correct me if I made any grammatical mistakes. And please, do share your thoughts on this. Okay, for starters, I did not believe any of this was real until after midnight last night. I believed everyone was just making things up and having communities like this to be a part of for shits and giggles. However, last night I saw something I could not and still cannot explain. I live in Newnan, Georgia. My house is very rural and surrounded by woods on all sides and all farms on my side of town. I do not know much about flesh pedestrians other than the mainstream stuff going around. Did not believe it was real. Met with my girlfriend about it all the time to scare her as jokes. Frequently mentioned their actual name. However, I got back to my house around 2 a.m. last night. I was on FaceTime with my girlfriend while I was driving home. However, upon arriving, and on about 80% battery I might add, my phone shut off and would not work. I didn't think anything of it. I get out of my truck and my dogs started going crazy, barking and growling loud. They only bark at people they don't know, as they are livestock guardians and don't pay animals they don't see as threats any mind. Anyways, while they are barking, I hear what sounds like fake barking close behind me. Almost like a person trying to sound like a dog bark. But if that person had never tried and was just shitty at it, it made my hair stand up because I had assumed it was a person in the woods behind me. I turned towards the sound and see nothing. The sound happens again, and when I look into the direction, I saw a creature I'll never forget. It was hunched on all fours, grey humanish face, large dark black eyes that reflected bright when the light was shined on it. No mouth, human-like body but with patches of fur throughout. Fur not covering body. Do not know any more details because as soon as I looked it in the eyes, it bolted towards me. I jumped in my truck and bolted. No more chasing. I called my grandmother who lives through the woods to give me an extra set of eyes so I know I'm not crazy. She, who has always been adamant that nothing exists paranormally, said she had been worked up by my dogs barking through the woods and a very high-pitched scream that sounded human and animal-like. We sat in the driveway and half-heartedly looked through the woods in the direction of the sighting. We began to hear a grunting in a different point in the woods. Loud grunting, kind of like a deer in rut. We turned to listen and then it started behind us. Then, the scream she had heard before was changing directions around us, when we would turn to hear it every time. Could not sleep after going inside. Locked all the windows and doors. Heard a tapping and knocking on my bedroom for about an hour. After falling asleep, I had recurring nightmares of that being watching me and hunting me from different places. Please help me ID. Sounds like a Navajo skinwalker, but I live nowhere near their land, nor do I know any Navajo. I myself am part Cherokee and Creek, but only about 15%. No native ritual land I am on that I know of. I have never been skittish. My girlfriend routinely has to tell me not to go look in the woods by myself after hearing sounds. But after these sounds and what I saw, I will no longer be going outside at night. So this takes place in the Sacramento, California area. It was about 2 years ago now. It was winter, nighttime, around 2 a.m. I had just gotten off work but wasn't ready to go home, so I pulled over on the side of the road before turning into my neighborhood. On this street, there's a suburban neighborhood to the right and fields and trees to the left. As I was sitting there, I saw a figure come out of the neighborhood, a little less than a quarter of a mile ahead of where I was parked. Approximately where the neighborhood park is. It was hard to see from that distance, but it appeared tall, 7 to 8 feet, super skinny and bony, hunched over with long arms. It sprinted across the road at a speed faster than I've ever seen a human go. I couldn't guess the speed, but it was fast enough to concern me. If it wasn't for its speed, I probably would have just assumed it was a human and ignored it. But anyways, it disappeared into the fields. Something calm came over me. I don't know what it was, but something was keeping me from panicking. I remember just feeling like, okay, it is time to leave now, and calmly driving home. It wasn't until a few months later that I realized I had seen that, and that it wasn't normal. Flash forward to a week ago. A friend and I were at the same park, doing some spells. We're witches. As it got later into the night, we both started to feel more and more unwelcome there. As I was finishing up my spell, we heard an inhuman, guttural scream that sounded like it came from the area I saw that creature cross at. That's not particularly incriminating, but as soon as I heard the scream, its apparent location made me think of the creature. I didn't tell this to my friend as she is easily spooked, and I just tried to calmly finish up my spell. Didn't want to let my fear get out of control when doing spell work. We finally finished up and packed up and started the trek back to the car. As we left, we faced a dark area with lots of bushes and trees across from the sidewalk we were taking to get to the car. As soon as I faced that dark spot, I had the feeling of looking at a face. I didn't literally see a face, but it was the feeling of seeing a face. And it didn't feel like a human face. It felt like something that understood what I was, but didn't understand why I was there. It wasn't quite hostile, but had the attitude of, get out of my home. Once again, I didn't tell my friend that I saw that. Not until we got into the car. Ever since then, I have not been able to shake the feeling that that face belonged to the same creature I saw 2 years ago. What do you all think? Also, similar story but not the same. Last night, I was driving in a wooded area near Sac, and I saw a tall, burly figure in the woods with a white face. Not white as in Caucasian. White as in stark white. I thought it was wearing a green t-shirt, but I only saw it for a split second. It gave me such a bad, uneasy feeling that I started putting protection sigils on my windows. I told the guy I was with what I saw, and he didn't tell me until later, but he said he's heard rumors of people seeing white walkers in these woods that are described as tall and having white faces and black hair. I don't know if he meant skinwalkers or what, but that's what he said. I also felt like something was watching me in those woods later. Any input is appreciated. This is my kid's story, but I'm inclined to believe him. I just don't know what to make of it either. We live in a rural area, dead-end road. We walk it daily, so we're very familiar with the scenery and the neighbours' habits. He likes to look at the stars, so he went out for his last walk around 9 p.m. Came in out of breath. I thought maybe he heard coyotes and they spooked him. He said he was walking past a group of trees when he thought he saw movement. So he shined a flashlight that way and saw a grey face peeking at him from behind one of the trees. After Googling it, he showed me a picture of a rake and said it looked similar, but smaller eyes that reflected green. He thought at first it was a deer, but he couldn't see the rest of the body as he walked, and it didn't move, just kept watching. He said he walked as calmly as he could and watched it from the corner of his eye for as long as he could see it discreetly. And as soon as he got to our immediate neighbour's house, he ran. I wanted to call it a deer, but those trees have no tall brush around them, and 3 to 4 feet or so between each tree, you could easily tell if a deer was standing there. And the group of trees are roughly 10 yards from the road, so near enough to see clearly given the heavy-duty flashlight he takes. We went out tonight to see if we could see it, but nothing. Not that I wanted to, but he insisted. He needed to stumble upon it again with a witness for validation. I'm more live and let live. You stay out there and I'll stay in here. But it's really bothering him, and things have been strange around here lately. So, any ideas? I was born and raised on the Isle of Wight, a tiny island at the very south of England, and didn't move off until I was 27 years old, around 3 years or so ago. So, I've done a fair amount of exploring on one of the world's most haunted islands. Ventnor Botanic Garden is situated where the Royal National Hospital for Diseases of the Chest once stood. This hospital was built in 1868. Built in this location because it was overlooking the sea, and doctors were convinced the fresh sea air would help cure the patients of tuberculosis and other such diseases. It was demolished in 1969. My friends and I have spent a number of nights breaking into these gardens and wandering around in hope to get a spook, but this only happened once. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. one nice summer's morning, around 8 to 10 years ago. My friends and I were sitting in the center of the garden on a bench which is allegedly haunted by a ghost of an older gentleman who doesn't like people going near his bench. We decided to sit in silence for 10 minutes to see if we could hear anything out of the ordinary. After around 5 minutes or so, someone or something about 6 feet away from us cleared its throat. I shined a torch, and there was nothing there, so we just got up and ran. We managed to accidentally split up due to the darkness and narrow pathways. I stopped for a second to catch my breath and heard the throat clearing again, about 6 feet away. I heard nothing running after me, so surely it couldn't have been the same person or thing as before. It just seemed suspect at the time because of the history of the place we were at. I'd like to clarify that there is no security in this place, and the only logical explanation would be people playing a prank. But for them to do this, they would have to have known which way we were going to run. Creepy as hell. Before I start this story, I'd just like to let you all know that I'm predominantly a skeptic, or at least I was until this house. I actually rarely talk about the events that happened in there because I don't have any rational explanation. But that house has stuck with me well into adulthood. Back in 2009, me, my mum and my stepdad moved into a really old, rustic, rural cottage in England. My father had passed away not too long before, and this was going to be a new start for us all. The house was an absolute bargain. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 very spacious living rooms, and a huge annex at the back that was essentially a second house. We couldn't work out why it was so cheap. We went for the viewing, and the family eventually told us that their elderly mother had passed away there peacefully in the annex, and they just needed to get away from the feeling of her. That probably should have been a first red flag. We weren't put off, and we bought the house. From the off, it was unsettling. My parents didn't see it at first, but I was incredibly uncomfortable there. It was extremely unnerving and cold. And not to mention, it was isolated behind rows of trees and a very long driveway, so far away from anyone else. It started on the first night. My room was at the end of the corridor, and if you came out of my room, on the right was a bathroom and a locked door that led to the annex, the place where the elderly mother died. My parents slept a long way down the corridor in the last bedrooms, so I was quite isolated, and directly opposite my room were the stairs. This first night was freakishly cold. I pulled my blankets up to my head, but after my dad passed away, I had suffered from insomnia for years, so the cold and the anxieties of moving to a new house all added together with this into zero sleep. So I ended up laying awake for hours just sort of staring around the room. My bedroom door was one of those old and mismatched wooden country house doors. It didn't quite reach the carpets, and after a few hours I could hear the creaking of floorboards directly outside my room, and shadows that seemed even darker than the darkness of the hallway walking past my door. I presumed one of my parents had gotten up to use the bathroom at first, but this went on, back and forth, for several minutes. And it was fast, a very brisk walk. And not to mention, next to my door was the locked door to the annex. Anyone walking at that speed would have hit the door, but nothing. It freaked me out, and had me dreading the next night. This kept happening every night for a few weeks, and I remember vividly one night I actually left my bedroom door open. Around the same time I heard the creaking. I turned around and unmistakably there was a figure, blacker than black, walking forward and backwards in front of the door, just visible in the darkness of the hallway. I couldn't take my eyes off it the entire time it was there. It's safe to say I never slept with the door open again after that night. But this is where things start to get properly creepy. I'd been terrified of this shadow for weeks now. There was a really horrible feeling I had around it, like it was after me. And one night, as I was going downstairs for dinner, I had the same cold feeling, and just for a second I froze in place in the dark hallway. I looked to my right, towards the annex door, and there, sure as anything, and without my sleepy eyes to blame it on, I saw the same black shadow walking directly at me at high speed. I ran downstairs as quickly as I could and told my parents everything. They mostly laughed it off because they didn't believe me, and tried to reassure me that ghosts aren't real, and there was no chance of anything about this old lady still being in the house. Now, a bit of backstory. This old lady was terrified of the previous owner's family dog, so much so that they had installed a pulley system in the house, so she could pull a cord from her bedroom that would trigger an old bell to ring in the kitchen if she wanted anything. The whole system was still there when we moved in, and this night, the night after I told my parents, I was awoken at around 2:30 a.m. by this bell in the kitchen ringing, loud, and on repeat, like it was being pulled firmly and constantly. I ran out into the corridor, and my parents were there too, equally as confused and concerned as I was. We all looked at each other, with ever-increasing worry, and ran downstairs into the kitchen to see what was going on. As soon as we entered the kitchen, it stopped. We ventured up into the annex to see what could have caused this, but nothing. No sign of anyone. And my God, I hated it there. It was even colder and more lifeless than the main part of the house, and I just felt like I needed to leave as soon as I could. My parents didn't quite believe that this was a ghost yet, but they were clearly less skeptical than before. From here, any activity became much more obvious. We, my parents included, started to hear knocking from the annex door next to my bedroom. Noises from downstairs that sounded like someone was down there moving. Sometimes my fish tank light would flick on and off with an audible click and wake me up, and I would often even wake up to my wardrobe doors being wide open with no breeze in sight. One night I was sat reading alone in my room, and one of these wardrobe doors opened by itself, wide and with relative force. I got up cautiously, closed it, and ran downstairs to see my parents. When I came up around 15 minutes later, every single cupboard door, around a dozen of them, were open as wide as they would go. Lots more went on too. Taps turning themselves on became a particularly regular occurrence, and one night I awoke to the sound of my cupboard door opening again, and saw droplets of water running from the bathroom next to the annex door, all the way to a few feet from my bed, with no droplets out again. I was terrified. It was around 6 months after all this started that we eventually moved out. My grandma had begun to grow unwell and couldn't care for herself anymore, and she moved in with us. From the beginning, she hated the house. My grandma was so incredibly sweet and calm, and I've never seen her distressed like she was there. And on one night in particular, when I was sat downstairs in the kitchen with her, she took my hand, pointed directly towards the annex and said, "Don't you go in there. I don't like it in there." It's safe to say, this scared the crap out of me. On the last night we all spent together in that house, I was awoken by my mum screaming. Clear as day, she said she felt two hands firmly grab her ankles over the bed sheets and pull her down the bed just a few inches. And right there and then, she asked to leave. We went to stay in our old house for a while, but because of size, my stepdad, the biggest skeptic amongst us, stayed in Lilac Cottage for a few more months. He's still quiet to this day about that house. He hates talking about it. But even he admits that there was something incredibly wrong there. And without much warning, he put the house up for sale, selling it so desperately that he lost almost a quarter of the price he had paid for it. He's never told us why. I promised myself that one day I'll reach out to the current owners of that house and see if they have also experienced anything, but I haven't just yet. Have any of you experienced anything like this before? So I work at an old Victorian prison in the south of England and have been doing this for a number of years. I've been at my current prison for about 3 years, and its most recent build dates back to the early 1800s. I worked at another Victorian prison before this for around 4 years, and its most recent build was in the 1700s. Parts of this prison were built by child apprentices before shipping them off to New Zealand in work colonies, and you could still see child handprints in some bits of brickwork. Anyway, my story. The wing I worked on at the time this story took place was used as the execution wing for many years and has seen some dark things. The prisoners used to be hanged on the second floor landing and dropped to their death through the hatch and dangled on the first floor's landing. Of course, this doesn't happen anymore, and it is simply used to house Category B convicted prisoners or those on remand. I was doing my count one evening at around 8:30 p.m. on the first floor landing when I saw a human-shaped shadow dart around the corner behind a set of stairs. I shouted, "Get back behind your door now," and then realized that I'd locked all the prisoners away and secured the wing 2 hours prior. I checked behind the stairs, and there was nothing there. I completed my count. All prisoners were present, but what was this shadow thing? As soon as it happened, I felt a cold chill, and my eyes started watering. I checked CCTV, and nothing can be seen apart from me spinning around quickly and getting out of there. I sit down on that landing and read books in the dark on my nights, and haven't seen anything since. My name is Luke, and I'm now 20 years old. This story happened to me when I was 17. This experience still gives me chills to this day. In May 2017, I found myself going out a lot more on my mountain bike. I was getting bored of cruising around the streets, so I wanted to go for a trail or woodland bike ride. I'd never been to Lee Woods before then. Personally, I don't think I'll be going alone again. After some research into a few different areas, Lee Woods seemed to be my best bet. Living only a couple of miles away, it was a nice bike ride. On arriving, it looked very peaceful, and I was almost in a dreamlike state by my first look of the place. For a woodland area in England, let alone Bristol, it was amazing. On going into the woods, I remembered seeing different colours at the start of each trail, signifying difficulty for bikers and length for walkers. Don't take my word on that bit, I still have no clue what they mean. So I decided to go down a coloured trail to see how it was there. I can't remember very well, I think it was blue. Finding it exciting, I decided to go down the harder trail, and now here's where it starts to get weird. I began having this weird sort of vision, looking around as if I'm being swallowed by the woodland. Everything felt like it was getting bigger and further away. I brushed it off, but it turns out I actually lost track of time. I got lost on the trail. Now bear in mind, I'm very observant and aware of my surroundings before this trail. I then came to a strange opening. I could go left in the rough direction of the way out, or right, deeper into the woods. Me being me, I decided to go deeper into the woods. I came to a weird little trail that just had dodgy written all over it. Metaphorically speaking, of course. I went against my gut feeling of turning back and went down there. I came to a point of which the trail continued, but it was getting dangerous. The trail being too bumpy for me to even walk down, I then turned back. But for a few minutes before turning back, I don't know why, but I was just stood still, staring down the trail. I felt like I was being watched from all angles, even though it would be near impossible to have that many eyes surrounding me in that area. I got nervous and began walking back up the hill, as I was too tired to ride at this point. Keep in mind, my bike tires are completely solid, no punctures or even anything wrong at all. Upon getting back to the spot where I originally went to the trail, that weird loss of time thing happened again. It felt as if the whole path had stretched by half a mile, as if the woodland was moving. I began walking up the path, feeling that same eerie sensation of being watched as I did beforehand. This time it felt a bit more sinister. It felt as if something was about to happen. Bearing in mind, I hadn't seen a single person at this point in time since I went down that first trail. I'll explain the scenery before continuing. It's a long path, a slight, steep hill to my left, a very narrow river to my right, maybe 4 feet deep and maybe 4 feet wide. Bushes on the other side of the river, with the odd tree every now and then. Upon getting about a quarter of the way up the slowly inclining path, I hear a woman crying behind a tree up ahead. I start slowing down my walking pace to try and get a good look behind the tree, but the whole time I'm thinking to myself, why would someone jump across to cry behind a tree? So I edge closer to the river to look behind to see if the person is okay. Also because many people go to Lee Woods to commit suicide, so I was hoping to maybe help this person. But you guessed it, there is no one there and the crying stopped. A bit weirded out, I just slowly turned away and started walking again, a bit quicker as I was unnerved at the time. I've had paranormal experiences before, but not usually in a place like the woods, usually in a house or some sort of building, so this was new to me. I had this sudden shiver as I was walking, and maybe a minute or so later, only a couple of meters away from where I heard the crying, it started again. But this time, it was right opposite me, across the river. I didn't bother looking. I started to go into a bit of a jog, and as I got faster, I heard the bushes rustling as if they, or it, was following me. Upon hearing this, I sped up, and the crying became more and more hysterical. Bear in mind, my bike was fine before this moment in time. I thought to myself, to hell with this, I'm gone. I went to hop on my bike with the adrenaline that was rushing through me, and I came to almost a sudden stop. My back tire on my bike had become completely flat, so I had no other choice but to sprint with my bike and pray for the best that I didn't trip up or end up having to throw it to run faster. With the crying person still closer to me and keeping up, I'm running faster and faster, praying I just get off this path that I was on. I had the feeling of wanting to cry because I couldn't actually do anything to help the situation or get out of it faster. After what felt like an hour, but in reality was probably only 5 or 10 minutes, I could see the car park. The crying had stopped following me and getting closer, and started moving back down to where I first heard it. I sprinted out into the car park. I must have been as white as a sheet of paper and hysterical with my breathing and wheezing as multiple people in the car park turned to look at me like I was crazy. I saw the exit sign out of the car park and ran towards it, and whilst doing so I noticed my bike to be moving a lot smoother on approaching the car park exit. I couldn't believe that my bike tire had suddenly regained all of its air. It was solid again as it was before the unnerving crying person shenanigans. I jumped on my bike and got away from Lee Woods as fast as I could, and have never gone back since every person I tell this story to becomes reluctant to go there with me or any extra people. The thing that makes this scary is I have Irish heritage. In Irish folklore, there is a demon woman called the Banshee. She is seen in woodlands, next to rivers and lakes, washing blood off of clothes. It is said that if you see her washing blood off of clothes, the person who owns those clothes will die. Alternatively, if you hear her crying, it means death. I can't remember the meanings exactly of the deaths, but it means either you or a loved one will die. Since 2017, I've lost my auntie, 2 of my best friends, and a dog. Lee Woods is no joke. There are many stories that have come out of Lee Woods too. You can read online about them. Search up Lee Woods Bristol haunting. It is rated 87th most haunted place in the UK according to Higgy Pop. It's a popular spot in Bristol for suicides. Or it was at least. Even the ghost of Isambard Kingdom Brunel has been spotted there, looking over the suspension bridge in which he designed. I live in Southampton, a relatively small but somehow the largest city in Hampshire, England. There is a small park by my apartment block that's been there since the 1800s that is usually frequented by families and workout buffs by day, and the occasional pop-up tent with a homeless dude in it at night. Of course, a fair amount of dog walkers at any time. I walk through this park a lot and have never seen anything out of the ordinary until around 6 weeks ago. It was around 11 p.m. and I decided to just go for a little evening walk through the park on my way home from the shop. I stopped off to have a cigarette. The park was silent. There were no humans in sight, and there were no cars to create even a speck of noise. For some reason, I felt the need to turn and look in a certain direction, and as I did, I noticed a medium-sized, white husky-type dog run about 10 meters across a bit of grass and run straight into a hedge. The dog made no noise, and the hedge made no noise. I was stood so I could see both sides of the hedge, and the dog did not come out the other side. I got my phone out and shined a torch around the hedge and around the park in hope of finding either the dog or its owner, but to no avail. Something didn't feel right, so I left with haste. My body was shaking, and I wasn't entirely too sure what had just happened. Maybe this dog is stuck in a loop, or just revisiting his favorite park. During the 3rd lockdown in the UK, January 2021 to March 2021, I was up in Derbyshire with my family. I am a student, so was in my last year of 6th form then. To do online school on Zoom, my parents suggested I go to the vacant cottage that my parents usually use as an Airbnb, so that I wouldn't be disturbed by the noisiness of the house, with both my parents working over Zoom and my younger sibling doing online school. This cottage was built by my great-grandfather, so my family inherited it. It's been renovated and looks relatively modern on the inside, but is in quite a quiet little village, and although not isolated, it can sometimes feel a little bit lonely. I would often sleep over there to finish my work and just relax, rather than getting my parents to have to drive out to take me home. And every night I did so, I would lock up at around 6:30 p.m. However, one night, it must have just slipped in my mind to lock up after finishing my homework, and I just went upstairs and took a bath. I came downstairs, watched some TV, when I realized I couldn't remember if I had locked the door or not. So, I went to the front door and noticed that the keys weren't on the table next to it. For context, I would always leave my keys on that table, without fail. I then checked to see if the door was locked, and, of course, it wasn't. the door swung out to the darkness outside. I closed it and started to retrace my steps, not yet too concerned about its whereabouts, just thinking I'd had it in my hands and put it somewhere stupid. So I've opened almost every drawer in this cottage, looked in the fridge, through the bins, in case I'd accidentally thrown it out with something, checked all my pockets, my bag, etc. Almost every place, including absurd places, just to be sure. It wasn't anywhere. I decided to go back downstairs and start all over again for the third time, starting from the front door when I saw the keys there, on the table, placed perfectly straight and neat and pointing toward me. I had checked that table twice and hadn't seen it before then. Yet there it was, perfectly in plain sight and right where I would usually leave it. I was immediately on edge. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was so unnerving to see it reappear in the most tauntingly obvious place possible. My first reaction was to grab a large kitchen knife and call my dad to come over, as I thought that maybe someone had crept into the cottage whilst I was bathing and was taunting me, playing mind games. He rushed over, checked over the whole house, but there was no one in the cottage except for him and me. He laughed at me for not looking properly, and no amount of assurance would convince him that it had just appeared. Once I knew that it wasn't an actual knife-wielding maniac, I felt fine again. But when I came home, my mum told me that my uncle had had a paranormal experience in there too. My uncle works as a builder, plumber, electrician, and he did some renovations in the attic. He's never lied in his life. In fact, he tells the hard truth 100% of the time, even if it would be better to say nothing at all. He told my mum that when he was in the attic in the dark, he heard an old woman's voice in a low tone ask, "Hello?" Apparently he bolted out of there. She didn't really tell me much else. There's another story too. When we were younger, we temporarily lived in the cottage when our house experienced some issues with the water pipes. One night, our babysitter experienced a sort of sleep paralysis, where she said she saw a shadowy figure of a woman come into her room and begin to choke her. When she woke up, she had her own hands around her neck and was coughing and spluttering. I don't know how much sleep paralysis plays into the paranormal, so I don't know whether to include it here. But maybe it could be connected. Anyway, I would love to hear people's thoughts on these events that have taken place in the cottage. As far as I know, no one who has used the Airbnb has complained of any issues. Right, so I'm not a believer in the paranormal, and to be honest, I'm still very skeptical. But I'll share my experience either way because maybe it could provide some answers. Around April last year, I visited the Castle Museum in York, England. I specifically went there for a birthday trip, and me being someone who is obsessed with history, it was a no-brainer going there. The museum was fantastic, and I had a great time going through the different floors and rooms it contained. About 1 hour in, we came across the prison section of the museum. Now, this wasn't a huge prison, more like a dungeon than anything else. There was maybe about 4 cells on each side, all open for the public to wander inside and look around. Now each cell was brightly lit, enough to see where you were going, except for one. On the very far left side was a cell that had no lights, no furniture, bed, tables, windows, nothing. It was pitch black and empty. So I decided that, as a challenge, I would go inside and stay there for 10 seconds or so. About 5 seconds in, I felt someone go right up to my left ear and whisper something. Unfortunately, I never heard what it said because I instantly panicked and ran out of the cell. Now, my first thought afterwards was maybe there was a speaker hidden inside the room, playing sounds to scare people. But unless the speaker was right next to my ear, I don't see how that was possible. My second thought was maybe a mischievous staff member or tourist decided to hide and scare us, but again, I would have had to have felt somebody leaning against me for how close it was. Sadly, I didn't ask a receptionist or anyone who worked there about the cell or if there was any other reported experiences. I really wish I did. But I did do research and found many stories and photographic evidence of paranormal encounters inside that prison section. So either the darkness got to my head and I imagined it, or I am in fact another person to make contact with one of the restless souls who still wanders the museum. Okay, so the first known time this thing happened was about 2-3 years ago when I was coming home from a detention I had after school that was an hour long. It was about 4:15 in the afternoon. As I'm literally stepping foot through the door, my brother and his friend walk into the kitchen. His friend looks at me and says, "How did you get downstairs so fast?" I was confused and just said I just got home. He started acting all weird with me, being like, "Stop messing about. You were just upstairs in your bed." I kept telling him I just got home, but he was dead set on the fact that I was asleep upstairs. My brother then went back upstairs and I just assumed he had forgotten something. At this point, my brother hadn't said a word to me. When we talked about it later on, he said the reason he went back upstairs is because he saw me too, in bed, and was checking to see if anyone was in my room. Since then, multiple people have seen me or something that looks like me around the house. It started off as it just being me, but recently my friend has seen my brother a few times. Once I actually heard her say hi to him in the kitchen and thought she was saying hi to me. So I went into the kitchen and she said, "What the hell? Where did Riley go? He was just stood there at the sink." I was laughing because I was sat in the living room, so my brother would have had to walk past me to get in and out of the kitchen. So again, I thought she was joking at first. Then I remembered I'd never even told her about the past experiences like this. I honestly have no idea what's going on. All I know is something keeps presenting itself as me and my brother to people, and it's getting pretty creepy. Does anyone have any ideas on what this might be? There have been so many little experiences that have happened in my house, and nearly everyone has seen something. Not a single one of my friends have stayed over and not experienced something. A couple of more examples. Me and one of my best friends were sat downstairs. At like 1 or 2 a.m, she had fallen asleep, and I was still watching TV when the door to the kitchen started rattling. Just a little at first. I blew it off because it does that sometimes due to the slight draft from my front door. But then, the handle started shaking aggressively, like it was being messed with. I woke my friend up and told her we were sleeping in my room instead. We fell asleep with my door closed and locked, which I don't normally do, but my friend couldn't sleep unless it was dark. At about 3:30 a.m, my friend wakes me up and tells me my door just opened. I looked at my bedroom door and it was wide open, but it was locked from the inside and there's no way to open it from the outside. It also couldn't have been her because I have a single bed, so we were pretty cramped in next to each other. I would have felt her get out of bed to open the door. Another small thing that happens very often. My great-grandma passed away a couple of years ago, and because my bedroom is extremely small, my nana, her daughter, gave me my great-grandma's wardrobe, as it's very small and could easily fit. I also have my grandma's engagement ring, which she gave to me when she was alive. When I tell you I hear knocking from this wardrobe every day and every night, I kind of make a joke out of it. And we'll be like, "Okay, come on. Nah, Laura, stop it." And it will stop every time I tell it to. There's also a specific corner in my living room. It has a big leather spinning chair in it, and has always given me the strangest feeling, like very uneasy. One night, me and my brother and 2 friends were sat watching TV, and no one was sitting in that corner, when all of a sudden, one of my friends looked over and screams, then starts covering her eyes. I started covering my ears and freaking out a bit because I was startled. When we asked her why she screamed, she said that she saw a tall, dark figure of a man stood in the corner behind the chair. There's loads more that have happened in my house, and none of it seriously creeps me out, apart from whatever that thing is that keeps appearing as me or my sibling. Something about that makes me feel very uneasy. I've lived in my current house for around 5 years now. It's not a very old house, built in the mid to late 2000s. But I've occasionally had some odd experiences. They don't happen very often. Just for fun, one time I decided to do a voice recording while I slept. In the morning I listened back to it. About 26 minutes into it, I hear this deep growl. It is very faint, and I mean really faint. I had to turn up my volume all the way to hear it. It was very creepy. There's also been a couple of times where I've heard knocks coming from my brother's room on the wall that connects our rooms. I'd go to his room to see what he wants, but he's not there. He was actually downstairs watching TV in the living room. I've also heard what sounded like someone digging in a bucket of Legos coming from his room as well, only to find out he's downstairs again. We do have cats, but they were not anywhere near his room at the time. More recently, something knocked on my bedroom door twice. I yelled, "Come in," thinking it was my mum needing something from me, but nobody answered or came into my room. Not long after this, I was walking downstairs, and as I turned to go down the second set of stairs from the landing, I see a white, misty figure on the stairs behind me. It could have been a reflection from my glasses, but there were no lights on, and nothing shining behind me or close enough to cause a reflection. I'm not sure what to think about all that's happened. When I was pregnant, me and my kid's father stayed at his cousin's house for about a month before we moved into our apartment. It's an old farmhouse in a newly developed area of Warwick, Rhode Island. There are farms and woods in one direction and a small town in the other. We were told when we moved in that the house had been built in the mid-1800s, which to me was super interesting until my kid's father, I'll call him Brian, remarked at how the stairs seemed awfully dark and creepy in the middle of the day. And when I looked, he was right. It gave off such a sinister vibe. We slept in the living room, and at night could see through the kitchen, and it was as if the stairs became a dark, uncomfortable void. When we brought this up to Brian's cousin and his wife, they proceeded to laugh and tell us stories of people being pushed down the stairs. I don't think they believed in ghosts, and the husband was an abusive drunk and drug addict, so they had enough problems clearly. That house was chaotic. The husband and wife clearly were having serious issues, emotionally and financially. They had a 6-year-old son who was afraid to sleep upstairs by himself because the shadows scared him. Great. After being in the house alone a couple of times and seeing genuine human figures out of the corner of my eye, or even better, black dots on the floor with what looked like long spindly legs running out, but when you'd look at them straight on, would disappear. A few times I would see a figure out of the corner of my eye, look and see one of the family members who I hadn't heard come in. I think that freaked me out the most, because how can you explain to yourself seeing a person and sometimes nothing being there, other times You expect it to disappear, but it would in fact be a person standing there this time. So weird. Brian would say how sitting in one chair in the living room, you'd want to look over your shoulder into the doorway, as if someone was coming down a set of stairs that used to be there. This also freaked me out, considering I slept right near the doorway and often would get a feeling of someone coming toward me. One day, me and Brian were the only two in the entire house, facing one another about 2 feet away, face to face, talking loud as we usually do. Directly in the middle of us, we heard a woman's voice say, "Shh." I asked if he had said that, and he stared at me with huge eyes and asked, "No, did you?" Then we laughed it off, as we were clearly talking too loud for the inhabitants, apparently. We eventually brought this up to the family, who included a second cousin living upstairs, and they confirmed that they too saw and felt things. They told us they assumed the black voids that ran on the floor were just one of their dogs and ignored it if it wasn't. The cousin who lived upstairs said that the curtains to his closet often moved, like they were being pushed, but he chalked it up to being stoned or tired. There was no breeze. The wife told me when they first moved there, her son would see a man in a hat, but assumed it was his imagination. How could you live in a house so clearly haunted and just pass it off? The front of the house at night was avoided by basically everyone, as it was right where it felt like someone was walking by the doorframe at you in the living room. One night, I didn't feel like walking all the way around this huge house to the car, so I walked as fast as I could to the car through the front door. I heard a deep growling coming from the side of the house. They owned 3 dogs, one of which was a bull mastiff. Too freaked out to call for her, I ran in and, to my horror, all 3 dogs were in the house. Needless to say, I didn't use that entrance again. It was such an emotionally depressing house, and maybe me being pregnant, I was just more aware of everything. There were other weird things, but one of the last conversations I had with one of the roommates renting a back room, it was down a long hallway at the very end, the only door in this isolated hallway. I told her about me and Brian hearing shh directly in the middle of us. She explained she hears the exact same thing in the hallway if she and her son were getting loud, but was sure it was the owner's young son sneaking into the hallway. But I'm not so sure. So my friend had moved into a shared house in the old side of Roseville, California. He invited me over about a week after moving there. He lived with a couple of girls who were in a relationship, and also moved his newish girlfriend in with him. The girls occupied one end of the house near the backyard, and my friend and his lady were in the bedroom next to the front door. There was another bedroom in the middle of the house that connected to my friend's room via a conjoined bathroom. This was the only bathroom in the house. So the first night my friend invites me over to hang out. I'm at work, closing manager at Taco Bell, and I tell him I'll be a couple of hours before I can come over, and he says that's fine. They just made some edibles and there were plenty to spare, so come over and chill. A couple of hours later, I get off and head over to his house. Upon knocking on the door, the 2 roommate girls answered. They told me that my friend and his girlfriend had eaten some edibles right after making them and promptly passed out after inviting me over. Not that surprising when it comes to my friends. They invited me in anyway, since I had made the drive out, and also brought some weed with me. We played All-Star Battle Royale on PS4 until about 2 a.m. When they were turning into bed, they directed me to the guest bedroom. So the layout of the guest bedroom is as follows. It is right off the living room and is conjoined by the bathroom to my friend that I came to visit's bedroom, where he and his girlfriend were sleeping. There was also a pull-down attic door on the ceiling near the standard sliding door mirror closet. When I had first entered the room, I jokingly said to one of the girls that the attic was creepy as hell, and I had to open the door once myself to know what kind of noise it made, so I'd know when to nope the hell out if I heard it while sleeping. So about 15 minutes later, I'm ready to sleep and I'm plugging my phone into the wall socket and setting my alarm. As I'm slightly bent over messing with my phone, I hear the telltale creaking noise of the attic door opening. I spun around and looked up, and sure enough, it was open a few inches, but there was nothing but darkness to be seen in the gap. It honestly scared me quite a bit, but the bed was much more comfortable than the couch we had been hanging out on earlier, so I was determined to sleep in the room. Ghosts be damned. I mustered up the courage to close the attic door, with some effort mind you, and lay down to go to bed. A little while later, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard the noise of what sounded like my friend waking up, stretching, yawning, and walking through the living room. I laughed to myself a little bit, thinking that he probably had extreme dry mouth and was heading for some water. Then, I was suddenly struck by a feeling of dread. I didn't hear any footsteps as the voice crossed the living room. Immediately, upon realizing this, the light switch on the wall by the door near the living room flips on hard, like someone slapped it up with force. My eyes were already closed when this happened, and I'm somewhat ashamed to say, I shut them even harder when I heard the light switch. I laid there for a long time, artificial light searing through my eyelids, and eerie silence hanging in the air. Eventually I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, though I don't know how long it took or what time it was. The next morning I was the last person in the house to wake up. Everybody was up and in the common areas of the house making breakfast and talking. The door from the guest room to the living room was open and the light was off. Most strangely though, my socks were neatly folded and tucked behind a mirror, leaning against the wall. Tucked as in pinned where the mirror was leaning against the wall, even though I had kicked them off while laying in bed. I walked out to where everybody was conversing, and after saying hi to my friend and making fun of him for passing out, decided I would talk to them about what happened the night before. I started off lightly with the questions, not wanting to be the crazy friend who doesn't get invited back to hang out. So the conversation went as such. Hey guys, good morning, etc. So, did anyone go into the bathroom last night through the room I was sleeping in? Various responses of nope, nah, we slept through the night. Okay, so nobody would have turned on my light then. Again, nope, didn't touch it, etc. And was it on this morning when you guys woke up and came out? Again, nope, it was off when we woke up, and nobody said they turned it off. Okay, final weirdest question, I said, half laughing. Did anyone pick up my socks and tuck them behind the mirror? At this point, they all stopped what they were doing and were just staring at me. I thought my sanity was being seriously questioned when finally one of the girls said something along the lines of, "Wow, so the house is already messing with you?" I stayed over there at the house 4 or 5 days a week for the next few months because of my curiosity about the haunting and the property itself. There were a lot more occurrences I can write about, if you guys are interested, that ramp up in intensity as time goes on. First, I'd like to give you an idea of the property. There was the main house with the room I've described and the bedroom attached via the bathroom. The living room was attached to both of these rooms and continued into a small dining room area that was then attached to the kitchen/washing machine dryer area, and an additional bedroom where the girls slept, which had the only door to the backyard. In the backyard there was a workshop or garage area. I call it a garage because there was a manual roll-up door attached to the side that we never used, as it was extremely rusted. There was also a small attic on top of the garage space, with a full stairwell leading up to it. Inside of the room, we found a fairly thick stack of old newspapers, 40s if I remember correctly. Inside the room, it was always the polar opposite of the temperature outside. Like, if it was cold with cutting wind, then the inside of the garage attic would be warm and musty smelling, almost heavy. If it was a hot-ass dry day, like it often gets in California heat, it would be cold as ice, with your breath visible in the air. As Halloween was approaching, we decided to throw a party with a bunch of our friends. We went about setting up for the party and ultimately decided that the attic would be the ideal beer pong spot. So we set up everything in the attic, and while we're up there, we notice a door that seemingly has no use. I decide to be the one to look inside. Upon opening the door, I saw that the entire floor was covered with packing peanuts, with another mysterious door at the far end of the left wall, semi in the shadows. Not trusting the flooring to support my weight, and really not wanting to go in anyway, I shut the door and continued setting up. The party was really fun and went off without a hitch. We all played pong in the attic with people going up and down with no problem throughout the night. The next day was a different story. I took it upon myself to clean up the house, since I had played my fair part in planning the whole thing. Being one of the first people to wake up, I decided to start with the attic, clearing out the beer bottles, red Solo cups, and random detritus. I managed to get the trash and even the collapsible ping pong table out of the attic, and went back to close it up for good. In a standing position, I tried to close the attic door entirely, and upon pressing up on the door, it dropped back down a couple of inches like that first night. Same noise and all. I tried pushing it up again. I'm 6 foot tall with longer wingspan, so plenty high enough to press without much effort. And it dropped once more. Frustrated, I decided I would jump up and force it into place. At the apex of my leap, I pressed upward hard and held in place for a second. As soon as I let go, the attic door came flying down back at me with at least twice the force I shoved it up with. I had to spin and move to the right to avoid the heavy door slamming me into the wall. It was at least 100 pounds with the cover. The force was enough to crack a glass-covered photo and the paint on the wall behind it. After the party cleanup, things were pretty relaxed for a while, save one thing. The shared bathroom that connected the guest bedroom to my friend's bedroom had a very Salvador Dali feel to it. It is the best way I can think to describe it. The dimensions seemed strange, even though there was no real reason to feel like this since the architecture was pretty standard. On top of this weird dimensional strangeness, every person that occupied that bathroom for a few minutes or more would start to hear voices. More specifically, the voices of the other people in the house saying mean, nasty things that were always at the forefront of said person occupying the bathroom's insecurities. It happened to me on more than one occasion, to the point where I, and literally all our friends that came to visit, would come out of the bathroom and have to seriously ask if our best friends were talking the most messed up, nasty shit about me behind my back. I truly thought they were, until a fairly new friend came over and asked the same of us when she came out of the bathroom. I still decided to stay over at the house because I, as well as the girls especially, was very freaked out and curious as to what was happening. One night while I was at work, the girls and my friend were sitting out on the patio area, near the backyard garage where we would smoke cigarettes. The topic of conversation got around to me, and they said as soon as we mentioned your name, we heard a loud thwack sound come from inside the garage. Upon investigating, they saw a hatchet that had been placed on the wall between nails, had fallen straight down, and stuck blade side into the wooden top of the workbench below it. A little detail first. I live in the Ozark Mountains. I have about 63 acres of land on a mountain, and I'm about 20 minutes from both towns near me. My house was originally a cabin built in the 1800s that someone had built onto. I don't have much more knowledge of the house because all the paperwork burned in a courthouse fire. Weird shit has always happened in and around the house, but those are stories for a different time. Last year, around February, I had a huge argument with my husband and decided to go hike up in the mountain to cool off. My husband went to work on his Jeep, and my 5 dogs and I went up the mountain. Normally my dogs run around through the trees, but they always keep me in their sights. This time, they stuck very close to me. I noted it and just assumed it was because they knew how upset I was. We made it to the clearing, and it just seemed so still up there. I felt a little uneasy, but ignored it and climbed up our deer stand. I sat up there for about 20 minutes, took some pictures, and I looked down to see my dogs at the base of the tree, standing in different directions in alert stances. The feeling of dread washed over me. I scrambled down the deer stand and walked across the clearing with the dogs in tow. I did not want to run because we have predators. All of a sudden, I could hear loud whistling. I stopped in my tracks. My dogs are now on high alert and all staring behind me to the left. My husband's voice came from that direction. He was screaming my name like something was wrong. I cannot describe the fear that came over me. I continued to walk down the mountain and walked over to my husband and asked him what was wrong. He looked at me confused and told me he had no idea what I was talking about. I kind of forgot about this moment until today. I woke up to a loud whistling outside of my house, around 4:40 to 5 a.m. It was the same whistle I used to call my dogs home. Parts of the whistle were wrong. All of my dogs were inside and my husband was still asleep. Part of me told myself to go check it out, but a voice in my head said to stay in bed. I listened to the voice. Update. We are okay. These past days have been quiet. Our 2 male dogs have refused to go inside except to eat. They've been guarding the house. This happened to me late August when I was driving down from Washington to San Diego with some friends. The 3 of us were camping in cool spots along the way, and at one point during our trip, we stopped to camp for a night near the Sierra Nevada mountains. My friend had heard that the sunrise's reflection over the mountains is beautiful, so we decided to wake up around 5 a.m. the next morning to watch. That time came and we reluctantly left our tent and walked about 10 minutes from our pretty remote campsite over to a long road and stretch of desert with a great view of the mountains. We stood there for about 20 minutes. Then, as I was looking across the distance, something caught my eye. It seemed to be some type of animal, but a weird size and super white. At first, I thought it was a bunny, but then decided that there was no way, as it was way too large for that. The figure was maybe the size of a large dog, bright white, and moved in kind of an unnatural way, like jerky and fast. I remember the face being really weird, kind of indescribable. It gave me goosebumps as I stared at it, trying to figure out what I was seeing. I looked over to my friends and asked them if they were seeing the thing that I had described. When I looked back, I couldn't see it anymore. Neither of my friends had seen this figure, but they shared a look, and one of them did a motion like 2 fingers walking on his arm. The other nodded, and they told me they didn't know what it was, but we should go back to our campsite. After that experience, I asked them what they weren't telling me a bunch of times. I kind of thought they were playing a joke on me, but I was still persistent with my questions. They told me to drop it until we made it to San Diego, and promised they would explain it when we got there. A few days later, as we drove into San Diego late at night, I brought it up again. That's when I learned about the Skinwalker for the first time. They told me that they've read stories that sound exactly like what I saw, and noted how weird it was that I described the figure like that without ever having heard of the Skinwalker before. I was so freaked out, and I was glad they waited to tell me. They told me that they waited to share because they didn't want to risk anything by thinking or talking about it. I'm not sure if I saw the Skinwalker that day, or if maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. I'm just definitely not eager to return to the area anytime soon. So, I was chilling at home and my other friends were out hiking. I wasn't invited because I had college courses that day, but when they came back, they recited an experience to me. So my friends, including my best friend Brandon, were hiking around the Cherokee National Park, and before they knew it, the sun had set. Brandon was trying to get down to a second part of their trail faster, and he slid down the side of a hill. Little did he know his pocket ripped, and his phone fell out of his pocket. He didn't know until about 15 minutes later when he went to text somebody and didn't find it. They were already back where they were at this point, but they used SnapMap to see where his phone was. He ran back to get it and picked it up. He placed it securely in an unripped pocket until he heard a blood-curdling scream. He's had similar experiences, but not this close. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion, until they distinctly yelled, "Help! Over here!" He walked up the incline and looked between the trees to see where the sound was coming from. And across the way, he saw a man standing on a neighboring mountain. The screams stopped, and he just stared over at Brandon, an unmoving silhouette. This continued for a few seconds before Brandon's fight or flight suddenly kicked in, and he went with it and just started running as fast as he could back to the meeting grounds. He looked back once and recited to me that the eyes of whatever was chasing him were reflective and too big to be a mountain lion of sorts. He ran for about 8 minutes, and then he ran into 2 other friends that were on the trip, Caleb and Alex, and they were like, "Dude, what's wrong?" Brandon wastes no time explaining and just tells them, "Just fucking run." And so they did. They ran for another 10 minutes. All the while, the 3 of them exclaimed that they kept hearing screams, all in different tones of voices, male, female, etc. They finally got back, still feeling the chasing, and urged everybody to just get in the car. After that, they sped off and didn't look back. They still haven't gone back. To me, this sounds like a Skinwalker encounter, but what do you all think? Because I know since they're Navajo creatures, they mostly reside in the Midwest areas. But I just don't know what else this could have been. We're in East Tennessee. I live the furthest out from all my friends, 25 minutes from the nearest town, and walking distance from the Cherokee Park border. I was responding to a call in the middle of the Mojave Desert around 10 p.m. on a lonely road that leads to Pahrump, Nevada. As I was driving, I see to my left a human-like figure running through the desert. The man-shaped creature was all black and appeared to be running like 30 miles per hour. I turned on my lights and pointed in that direction, but it vanished. I freaked out a bit, called my girl, and told myself I'm new to the area. I'm probably just afraid and tripping out. I handled my call and forget it happened. 2 weeks later, I responded to a call with my partner, who was driving his own patrol car. My partner arrested a guy in a car, so I waited with the suspect car until the tow truck driver arrived. I sat in my car in the darkness. No biggie. I see the tow truck driver in the distance, headed my way. As he arrives, the tow driver immediately comes to my car and says, "Are you alright?" I say I'm fine. And he says, "I wanted to come check on you because I just saw a man running away from your car." I say, "Shut up, bro." He says, "Yeah, it looked like a tall man wearing all black running full speed away from your car." I tell him to get into my car and he and I go search for the guy, but don't see anything. At this point, I go back to the office and share my experience. They think I'm crazy. A few weeks go by. I'm on a call of a traffic collision with parties ejected. After clearing the scene, I walk back to my car. I hear some screams for help near my car. I start to yell, "Where are you?" and point my flashlight. I see nothing. A partner who is near me also hears them. We both go searching, but the screams stop. Never found anything. Everything I'm recounting in the story here is 100% true. I'm not going to try to persuade everyone that this is for certain a skinwalker or anything. But this crept everyone involved in this story out, including me, a pretty big skeptic when it comes to this sort of thing. I'd also like to apologize for the length of this story in advance, as there's a lot that needs to be mentioned to set the scene. Here it goes. It all starts when a couple of friends and I, who I will refer to as Q, R, and S, wanted to have a guy's vacation and go camping somewhere back in May 2021. As a little backstory, Q was my best friend, and S was R's younger brother. We chose a spot that we had been to once before, but when we got there, we decided to drive out another 3-ish miles away from the previous destination. The area wasn't extremely in the middle of nowhere, as some of you might think. There was a dirt road wide enough for a decent-sized truck to go up and down the road with ease. Once we decided on a place to camp, we realized that not a soul was in the general area for probably another mile. The only evidence that there was anyone near us was the distant sound of gunshots, as the shooting was allowed in this area at the time. The only things alive in the area that we could see were larger than a bird, were the grazing cattle, caged in by a fence. One of the main activities we would be participating in was trapping coyotes. For those of you who don't know, coyotes don't require a tag to kill, and you can hunt as many as you want, as they are extremely quick to reproduce. We set up the traps about 500 yards away from our campsite in a valley that a creek was running through. We could tell that this was a bottleneck for the coyotes to travel through, as many game trails were coming down to this checkpoint, and we were certain at least one coyote would come through. We set up the traps and then headed back to our campsite. We got back and the sun is beginning to set. Being the middle of May, the sun was out in full force where we were at, approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We were already exhausted from hauling around the heavy trapping gear, but this heat was just making it worse. It got to the point where the only thing we could do was sit in what little shade we had and wait for a couple of hours until the sun was down. A few hours later, the sun finally sets and the temperature begins to drop. We search around with our flashlights to find any dry sticks and dead sagebrush in the ground, all with the cows mooing in the background. Once we get our fire lit, we sit around and are laughing, reminiscing on old times, and just being happy to be around each other. A few minutes go by, and we're all just sitting around the campfire in silence, when we hear a strange, high-pitched whine. I remember S asking R what the sound was, and R tells him it was probably a coyote or something. The sound keeps persisting, and whatever was making it was getting closer to the campfire. Every 10 or so seconds the creature would call out. We went from laughing at it to just being confused the more we heard it, and the closer it got. Then, when we hear the thing call once again, probably around 40 feet or so in front of me, it's silent for only about 5 seconds this time. And not even kidding, we heard the same call, but this time from only like 20 feet behind me. This might not sound scary to a lot of you, but at that moment, it was chilling. We all scrambled up and we were feeling paranoid. So R assembles his .22 that he brought with us. Then out of nowhere, the creature is back to where it once was, about 40 or so feet in front of me again. We're all spooked and confused on how this is even happening. While Q, R, and S are talking, I pull out my phone, tell them to shut up, and try to record the sound that this thing is making. We all decide to try to follow that noise and see if we can find anything. It seemed to be leading us somewhere, but we weren't sure. As we followed, the thing was keeping a good distance between us, no less than 40 feet at a time. We crossed the cow fence, which was quite the task because it was coated in barbed wire. It's a bit strange too because that creature crossed through it without any sound. It kept pointing us in a direction that was leading to another creek. But as soon as we got there, we heard it from about 50 feet up a hill, which no animal could have done in that short of a time without making any noise. We got shaken up by the whole thing, so we just went back to our tent. As soon as we got up, however, Q pulled me aside and mentioned that he thought he saw something duck down when he shined his light at the hill the creature was leading us to. Throughout the night, we kept hearing that thing circling our tent, making those whining noises the entire time. We ended up spending another night there with the same things happening, but no harm came to us. The whole thing was just super unsettling. We didn't end up catching anything on that trip either. Now, before any of you ask, I'm going to clarify some things. This took place in southeastern Tooele County, Utah. The place we stayed was near a small town called Vernon. We're almost certain it wasn't a cow. Cows are loud, clumsy creatures. I mention this because none of us heard any movement, and even the baby cows can't move that high. At least, not from the ones that we heard. Also, how could it have crossed that fence? They had also gone around the hill to a different side of the owner's property. We were completely sober during the entire campout. None of us had even done drugs or drank. Maybe the heat exhaustion could have had a hand in it. We were able to find some coyote tracks, but we weren't sure if they were there before or after that night. Also, they were quite the distance away from our campsite, and they seemed to be going in completely the opposite direction from where the creature was taking us. So we ruled that out. I didn't record the descent into the valley because I got caught up in the moment. I wasn't thinking about much other than trying to figure out what that creature was. Also, my phone was very close to dying. It was most likely a coyote. That's what we thought at first, but coyotes don't sound like that. They also usually travel in packs and are extremely loud. They sound more like high-pitched dog barks. There is a chance it was a bird, but that's a theory that I'm trying to tell myself. It's just strange though, because no other birds were out that night. We are fairly certain it was just one creature, but the truth is we don't know for sure. But I am going to assume that there was just one because the sound never played at the same time from two different areas. Also, when we heard it from directly behind me, it never came from there again, only straight in front of me, leading us to that creek and beyond. I'm very skeptical it was some kind of a skinwalker, but I honestly have no clue anymore. I did a little research on the area we stayed, a few months after the whole ordeal. The area we were camping at was old Cochute territory, before the Spaniards came back in the 1600s. I looked and there were hardly any Cochute legends that I could piece to something like this. I've been trying to do some research but haven't found anything like this. Does anyone have any ideas on what this could have been? A few months back, I was staying the night at my friend's house. He lives on the far edge of a town in Utah. He still had neighbors around, but there was a lot of forest around, and it was next to a canyon. I don't know if the scenery helps to the story, but I will try to list every detail of my encounter. I was staying the night, and my girlfriend also came over to hang out for a while. We hang out, and everything is fine and fun and great. 1 a.m. rolls around, and I had work at 6 a.m. in another town about 30 minutes away. So I said, hey, maybe you should leave so I can get some sleep before work. And at this time, my friend went to sleep, and it was just me and her. As we were walking to her car, I started feeling uneasy, like I could hear something. We get to the driver's side of her car, and I give her a hug goodbye. As I'm hugging my girlfriend, I look behind her and am struck with shock and fear as I see a creature maybe 8 to 9 feet tall. It was standing next to a cherry tree on the side of my friend's driveway. It was bipedal and very skinny. The moon was out, so I could see the creature clearly, but not so much the color details. The legs were bent backwards like a deer legs, or like the back moose legs. It slouched a lot, and I still couldn't see its face as it was in the leaves of the cherry tree, which has to be around 11 to 12 feet tall. I remember not being able to talk much except goodbye to my girlfriend. I don't know why, but I couldn't tell her to look behind her. Before I let go of her, though, I saw the creature move. It took off running towards the tree line. What absolutely baffled my mind was the speed of the creature. It looked impossible, as if it was blurry when it started running. I remember it looking right at me through the leaves, even though I couldn't see its face. What was the worst thing about the experience was the emotions attached to seeing what I saw. I felt like my confidence and emotions were attacked. I've never felt the feeling of fear like this before, and I have been charged by full-grown brown bears. After my girlfriend got into her car, I stood in that very spot from when I hugged her until she left the driveway. I don't know if it was more out of fear or just making sure she left safely. I didn't know what to do, so I slowly walked over to my car and got in. I called my friend multiple times, and he was asleep and didn't answer. I looked out my window after several minutes and looked to the left and saw my friend's cat, Avery. And I tried to think logically. If my friend's cat, which probably has better senses than me, is out here, then I am probably seeing things, and it was safe. So I got out and stood next to Avery. Next thing I know, it sounds like there's a Clydesdale horse running through deep growth of the forest. Avery started running for the door, and I sprinted faster than Avery and got inside. For the next 3 hours, I sobbed and cried like I did when my dog died when I was 12. The fear I felt was indescribably powerful. I also remember it had long arms, and when it ran, it used all limbs. Please, someone tell me if this is a real creature. It gives me goosebumps to this day, thinking about it, talking about it, and just writing this brought me to tears. Just thinking about it is scary. I'm not that great of a storyteller, but I'll just quickly write what happened. We were staying at Hogan Airbnb on the Navajo Nation close to Monument Valley, and there were several very friendly, calm dogs roaming around. My friends and I, one of whom is deathly afraid of dogs, had no problem being with them or petting them. We had a gorgeous view of Monument Valley right from our door, and it was cold yet cozy. That night I needed to use the bathroom and opened the door to the dogs going absolutely nuts. There is a difference between a dog barking at just whatever, a person walking by for example, and then there was this total fight or flight response. One of the dogs ran up to me, looking anxious and glancing into the desert behind the Hogan. It came close, then walked back to look into the desert behind the Hogan. Its fur stood up and it suddenly looked more like a wolf and took off into the desert at full speed, growling and barking at a huge shadow that ran away from the dog. There aren't many huge animals in the area. Some deer and horses, maybe cattle, but this was bigger. I didn't stick around long enough to check what it was. I was pretty shaken by what I saw. I found some fresh wolf or mountain lion prints and hoof prints, probably from a horse, outside the hogan the next morning. The dog's prints are smaller. Our host said we might have seen a skinwalker. I'd like to believe it was a horse. It was dark anyhow, but the host didn't want to talk about it too much. The guides we met later on said the same thing and kept it at that. Later that day, one friend suddenly fell ill on a tour of another hogan and almost fainted. That never happened before in her life. The guide said she probably had some bad spirits attached to her. She recovered quickly after stepping outside. That's all. It was a really wonderful trip overall. I'd go again if I could. The title doesn't lie. My dad is a chair. To be specific, he's a fully upholstered, bright orange angel accent living room chair. The kind with wooden legs you'd find in any three-piece suite from the 70s. He's pretty comfortable, truth be told. A little lumpy in places, but his padding is soft. Warm, too. He's always warm. There's also the telltale ba-thump, ba-thump, ba-thump coming from his back cushion. A steady rhythm at my lumbar to remind me I'm sitting in no ordinary chair. He wasn't always a chair. Until last year, he was Kevin the accountant. He was 51, slightly overweight, and generally seemed to enjoy life as a human. He was married to Mum. He still is, but, well, as you can imagine, it's a little complicated now. It was funny at first. He came home from work one day and just sat in a corner of the living room. When we'd ask him why he was sitting on the floor and not the $4,000 cream leather couch, he'd just smile and say, "It feels right here." It stopped being funny the morning he didn't go to work. Turns out, he hadn't slept the night before. He'd been watching a movie with Mum, but hadn't gone with her to bed. She left him sitting in his spot, unsuspicious of the "I'm not tired, I'll be up a little later" lie. She and I both begged him to get up, but he refused to move. Phoned in sick at work, the whole deal. Just spent the day sitting on the floor in his corner. We kept asking him what was wrong, why he wouldn't get up except to use the bathroom. And he just kept saying, No, this feels right." Mum phoned the doctor around the third day of this. He'd stopped eating or drinking, you see. Stopped getting up to use the bathroom too. Surprisingly though, there weren't as many accidents as you'd think. Once he'd allowed the last of the food and drink to leave him, it seemed to stop coming. We also didn't hear his belly growl, despite going a day and a half without food. The doctor couldn't make sense of it. Their first guess was that it was psychosomatic, but that wouldn't explain the absence of digestive activity exposed by the stethoscope. They said they'd be back to take some blood samples in a few days after they liaised with some colleagues. Unfortunately, as I said, this was last year, 2020. We never heard back from the doctor thanks to the virus that shall not be named. I guess guy with gut troubles who refuses to move is low on the priorities list during a global pandemic. Somehow, Mum managed to wrangle long-term sick leave with Dad's company. Decades of loyal employeeism, combined with Mum's attendance of every company barbecue and softball game, helped Mr. Banafrag buy the unexplained stomach concern requiring hospitalization excuse. I'll never forget that phone call. At the time, Dad losing his job was a worst-case scenario for both of us. He'd always been the breadwinner. Neither of us could support ourselves without him. We'd lose the house in under a year. Dad didn't seem too perturbed by Mum's frantic pacing, or the lies she wormed through the phone to Mr. Bannerfrag. He just stared at the wall serenely, hovering his butt half a foot from the carpet, balancing with his legs bent and his hands flat on the ground behind him. That night I fell asleep, listening to Mum yelling at Dad. He never yelled back. We started noticing the physical changes a few days later. That's when we realized this wasn't psychosomatic. Unfortunately, our shitty best insurance deal in the market doctor wasn't picking up the phone. We'd get passive-aggressive emails informing us that they were waiting to hear back from colleagues, but that was it. This was not good. Especially not when the joints in Dad's arms and legs had fused. The not goodness of the doctor's silence increased 1,000-fold when we sent photos of Dad's hands and feet, flaking off like discarded spider husks the following week. Did the response change? No. We got a very snippy email about shortages on ICU wards and a critical international situation. Mum's shouting match with the chief of medicine, the one she demanded her way up the phone chain to speak to, didn't change things. We were on our own. Mum spent all her time in the living room with Dad. I had to help her wash him, try and make him eat, talk to him when she'd tire out and fall asleep on the rug. Every day of this routine brought with it new changes in Dad's body. It started with his limbs, as you can probably guess. When his hands and feet fell off, there was no blood. They flaked apart, crusty and dry and brittle throughout. Even the bones of his toes and fingers had the density and consistency of dead skin. The wrists and ankles they left behind were smooth and hard. It was difficult to tell whether we were looking at flesh or exposed bone. The dark, shining surface seemed to bend into his normal arm at the base of the stumps. This discoloration would rise further up his limbs daily, and before long I awoke to see Dad's head and torso fused to the wooden chair legs supporting my weight while I write this. Well, I use the term Dad's head and torso in the loosest possible sense. By the time his limbs were completely replaced, the rest of him had undergone a slow, harrowing transformation of its own. His shoulders and the arms attached to them descended lower and lower. They found their final resting place at Dad's pelvis, sat squarely behind his rigid legs. The chest area they'd left behind had its own problems. Day by day, Dad's neck retracted further inwards. It didn't stop when his jaw met collarbone either. It pulled Dad's head deep into his ribcage. His face flattened as the skull supporting it sank, forcing his eyes to point in opposite directions. Eventually they slid down to where his nipples once lay, resting glassy and vacant on his pecs. The change wasn't quick enough to break his jaw though. Instead, it bent outward, its hinges spreading wide across Dad's broad chest. Each morning I'd find Mum sobbing over a fresh, unnecessary piece of himself he'd discarded. Hair, ears, nose, his thingy. All of them flaked off and crumbled to dust in her hands. He'd lost the ability to speak as his head withdrew. Unsurprising though, right? He made his intentions clear before he went. The last words he ever said to me,
Don't cry. I am Chair. Always was Chair. Happy as Chair.
That was the worst part, I think. knowing that whatever the fuck was happening to Dad, he wasn't resisting it. That when he'd got that initial urge to sit in the corner and not get up, he didn't fight it. That he was happy this way. The implication being that when he was human, when he was a father and husband and accountant, he wasn't. Sadly, I still don't know why or how Dad became a chair. I didn't post any photos, you see. Mum wouldn't let me. Didn't want the embarrassment. Wanted to keep Dad's dignity intact. Thing is, I agreed with her, and kind of still do. I'm glad I didn't go to the socials with pics of Dad at various stages of his journey. The temptation was there to see if anyone could help. Nobody could have, though, could they? Dad would have become just another internet circus freak. I've done enough research and digging over the months to know that whatever happened to Dad, he's the only one. Well, almost only. Mum's own changes started around the time Dad's skin was re-threading into orange fabric, and his eyes had hardened into plastic buttons. Her change was a little different. It started in her torso, stretching her day by day while she remained in crab pose. I must say, she makes a great couch. Her transformation may have been a little more distressing, but the end result is better. Sorry, Dad. It is what it is. I think the worst part with Mum was the despondency. Dad was so serene as he changed. Mum, though. Mum wouldn't stop weeping. Quiet sobs. Tears that fell for a few days, even after her own eyes had become flat plastic. She wasn't crying because of the change, though, I think. I think it was because she wouldn't get to see how beautiful I'll look when I go through my own metamorphosis. Thing is, I get it now. Dad was right. He was chair. Mum was couch. I am coffee table. I always was. I was scared at first when I realized. The truth hit me like a piano dropped from the Empire State Building. I was scrubbing the last of Mum's remaining human skin when it struck through every bone in my wrong body, just as it must have done both Dad and Mum. I spent that whole night sitting on Dad, tears falling down my cheeks, staring at my spot. I didn't want it to be true. I screamed for it not to be, more than once. I couldn't deny the facts I knew deep down to my bones, though. That spot, the space on the rug in front of chair Dad and couch Mum, is for me. It's mine, where I belong. Unlike blissfully accepting Dad and weeping, resigning Mum, I fought it for a few days. I'm not like them. I'm only 17. I have, or had, dreams, ambitions, goals. I wanted to go to college, settle down, marry some lucky girl, be a dad. I wasn't ready to give up my human form. I spent my nights begging for more time. Nothing answered. The urges didn't abate. My awareness of reality, now the illusions had been swept away, was too great. When I have slept this last week or so, my dreams have always been the same. I dreamt of true reality, of how I now know things should be. I dream of me in my place, my body elongated and wooden and flat, as is right, as is correct, as is natural. I have long, blissful slumbers, filled with the feeling of hot ceramic mugs on my tabletop and thick carpet beneath my 4 legs. I can't fight it anymore. I'm posting this here, but also printing it out to leave as a note for the removal guys. I want them to be careful with us when the bank repossesses the house and we end up in storage. Please keep us together if you can. We're a set. Dad's sick leave ended months ago. As you can imagine, foreclosure notices have been piling up. I stopped caring about the pile of mail under the door, about the time that Mum's ribcage split and flattened into her wide pinstripe velvet upholstered back. I haven't been hungry in days, or thirsty. I'm not even sure if I'm breathing, now I think about it. I'm still scared, but I've come to accept that this is the way things have to be. I don't know why. They just do. Maybe it's a curse. Maybe this house is built on some ancient ritual site. Maybe it's just some freak anomaly of physics. Who knows? Whatever the reason, I have to suck it up and accept the way things are. This body, this walking, wobbling mass of skin and bone and ghibli bits that I love so much, isn't right. It isn't mine. I'm not meant for it anymore. Once I post this and print the copy for the removal guys, I'm going to get in my spot. Then, it's just a case of closing my eyes and waiting. I can already feel my limbs pulling inward, my thighs and upper arms sliding to where they'll meet at my navel in a few days. There's a tugging on the back of my knees where they'll bend in on themselves, and all 20 of my fingers and toes grow more numb with each hour that passes. Do I have any regrets? Thousands. There's so much I'll never get to do, to see, to go, to be. I can't hide from the truth though. Not anymore. I am coffee table.